All right, we are ready to go again here today. Let me make sure I'm on the right screen. All right, so Godot WildJam 93 is over. Ratings are done. I think the best I did was it number 16, I think, on control, and I think number 19 overall. I might be wrong about that. Either way, I do want to apologize for some of the technical issues the last couple streams. Working on the game jam and also trying to stream the whole thing puts you in a bit of a panic and you don't pay attention to some of the finer details. But that leads me into a couple of the improvements, starting with this stream. So one, right off the bat, I now have a second monitor hooked up so I can see what I'm broadcasting, so no more me talking about a game and how great it looks when you guys can't see anything. Two, the way I was capturing the Godot editor before was using window capture in OBS, which it doesn't really work great. I had to do that because I had to keep Godot minimized so that I could see OBS in the background. But the problem is OBS wouldn't capture any of the pop-ups, so like that would not get captured, or the project settings would not get captured, and it was a little awkward trying to explain what I was doing while I was doing it. It also meant that the game wouldn't get captured properly, but that shouldn't be an issue anymore. We should now have the full desktop capture, and it'll make it a little easier to show you what I'm doing. What am I doing? Well, ProtoJam, if you've never heard of it, I'm not surprised because I haven't released it yet. For the past, I don't know, about a year and a half, I have been collecting how I like to do various systems in my games. So damage systems, hitbox, hurtbox, health, death systems, background loading, credits, input management, various things that I feel like I need to redo over and over and over again in every one of my game jam games. And up until this last jam, that's what I've been doing. Every time I needed it, I would just go recode it again, which had some benefits. One of them was I was trying a lot of new things. If it didn't work quite the right way in the last jam, in the next jam, I'd try recoding it, modify it a little bit. Maybe it would work a little bit better, maybe it was worse. I kind of felt my way through what architecturally made sense, and kind of refining those APIs. I'm at a point now, and with Godot WildJam 93, where I feel pretty good about the way the stuff works. It's very easy to get it up and running. It's worked very well with very few issues. I don't get very many bug reports on anything that would be part of ProtoJam anymore. So that's where this add-on comes in. It's not attempting to be a game. It's not a template project. And it's not really intended for any specific genre. But what ProtoJam is a collection of all the little background services, utilities, and systems that most games need to work. And I've pre-built them. They're designed to be very easy to get set up and use them. And they're designed to be very, very flexible, which makes them ideal for game jams and prototyping, where you just want to get it done. And it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be super performant, but you just need the thing to work so that you can get on to making the gameplay and the content. That is the essence of ProtoJam. Just a little bit of a boost to get you through some of the boilerplate stuff you have to do with every new game. Now, if we look over here to the side, we have a lot of these systems have already been built. So I have a global audio management system, I have a background loader, I have a credit system, although that's a little less complete than the others, a damage framework that's, I think, pretty comprehensive. I haven't looked at a lot of the other add-ons for Godot. I just prefer to write the stuff myself. I would assume that this may be one of the more comprehensive damage systems with how I've built it. I might be wrong about that. Someone will have to let me know in the comments if there's something that is a little more flexible than this. Some input, I still have a few more things I need to add. Prototyping materials, and we'll get into some of this as we work on the example project. And a few other things: global saving, global data, settings, state machines, transitions. A lot of this I used during Godot WildJam 93. So we're not going to go enumerate it today. That's not what the purpose of this stream is. But I did want to show this real quick, since I can show my browser now. This is the to-do list of things that are yet to be added. Most of this I'm probably not going to wait to release the add-on. But this is just an idea of some of the things that are going to be coming, and you can pause the VOD if you want to pay attention to some of that. Now, what are we doing today? Well, I think, in my opinion, there's three types of documentation you need for a good project. You need the code level documentation, like your function contracts and that. I think I have that pretty good. If we come in here to one of these classes, like, I don't know, save data manager, every single thing in here is extensively documented. So if you go into Godot and you search for the global save data manager, every single one of these is documented. Everything you could possibly care about it is documented. Hopefully well, hopefully accurately. I may have done a little bit of copy pasting here and there might be some stuff that's not completely accurate, but for the most part, that's good. So that's your first type of documentation. It's just your function contracts, your low level stuff. The next type of documentation I think you need is the more directional content, which tells you, hey, if you're trying to do this, these are the things you need to look at. Because if you're just downloading this add-on, you're not going to know that these classes even exist. Unless you open up the folders, you don't know what's in it. Now that I'm going to write off stream. I'm not going to make you sit through me writing wiki content, but the plan is over here on the ProtoJam GitHub page, which is already public if you want to pull down a incomplete version of it. I'm going to enable the wiki on this thing, and I'm going to put some information there like, hey, if you're trying to save your game, these are the custom node types that'll help you. These are the custom resource types. These are the capabilities of the system, yada, yada, yada. That's all well and good, but usually when you write that kind of content, you have to keep it pretty generalized. Otherwise, it's going to be so specific that somebody's going to look at it and say, oh, well, that doesn't work for my use case. And in reality, maybe the system's more flexible than that, but you just had to show it in some way. So that's what I think the third kind of documentation is, and that is an example project. Something realistic, an actual put together game with all the functionality of a game put together that you can just look at the code and say, oh, that's how this is supposed to work. Because I mean, if you've done game programming for any amount of time, or any kind of programming, honestly, inevitably you will come across documentation for something and go, well, okay, you just showed me the most basic way to use this one thing. Like, oh, okay, you showed me how to do a portal, but there's 100 other concerns to make that work within an actual game. How do I go about doing that? Like, oh, okay, you taught me how to do pathfinding in Godot, but how do I practically use that with a navigation agent and all these other things? The practicalities of a game are just not there. And they're never going to be there in documentation because there's so many caveats you'd have to try and explain. It works best to just give somebody something they can look at and they can maybe copy it and start to tinker with it. So that's what we're doing today. I've talked about it enough. I need an example game, something that uses most, maybe not all, but at least most of ProtoJam's functionality in the way it's intended to be used to make a full and complete game. And the way I'm going to tackle this is I'm going to treat it like it's a game jam. I don't know what kind of game I'm going to make yet. I haven't decided. I had some thoughts about maybe like an arcade game collection. I kind of threw that out. I don't want to make 20 different games. So we're going to do the brainstorming. We're going to figure out what we're going to make, and then we're going to get into it. So right off the bat, there's a couple things I already have set up. The project has a main entry point. Every one of my projects I do this. And in here, I am setting up some of the ProtoJam systems. So this kind of gives you an initial idea of how it's intended to work. Although I'm probably going to ditch this application thing. Probably just add that directly. It's a very similar, if you watch the streams on Godot WildJam 93, which is the last series of streams I did, almost identical setup. This is how I've done almost all of my jam games, and it's how I prefer to do them. We might change that, we'll talk about it, but so these are various ProtoJam systems. So we have the background loader. ProtoJam does background loading using a thread, so you need to initialize the thread. So that's what this is about. Fairly straightforward. You literally just call start, and then you should I would say it's optional, but you really should check the error code to make sure that it worked correctly. And then we can see another ProtoJam feature here, this quit gracefully. This is a better way of quitting a Godot project that isn't going to cause problems. I'll say that. Normally when you tell Godot to quit, it doesn't tell any of the nodes that the game's about to quit, which can make it difficult if you're trying to save before the game shuts down. So when you use this quit gracefully, it will notify every node in the scene tree that the game is trying to close. And we're actually using that notification up here to save our settings and to stop this background loader. So this is the kind of stuff that probably needs to be documented. I might even bring this into an auto load that's part of the plugin. But for the moment, it's just sort of boilerplate that you do. Except maybe this instantiating an application. I might just drag that out into the scene tree. So we're getting everything set up. We got our audio manager, starting the application. So the way I handle things is main is your bootstrapper. This just sets up all your systems, loads any data that's required to just make the game function. And then application is usually more of your high level state about switching between modes, like your splash screen, your main menu, your credits, whatever. It's like the master state machine, but it's a state machine that exclusively handles high level modes of the game. It's not storing your game state, for example. So right now, this one's a little more shoddily put together. All it's doing is just, I have a switch to game, again, very similar to what I did in ProtoJam. So all this is doing is just switching between that and the menu, and then I have a level system built in. I don't know if we're going to do levels to whatever this game is going to be, but there's a level system built in. So all this does, and I'll launch the game to show it. And one thing I am going to do, I'm going to mute. We're going to mute that for the moment. I've got some Kenny music that plays whenever this launches. So we just have a play button, and then this is all it does. It just launches into a 3D scene, doesn't do anything. But that's what application is doing, is handling that switch off between the two. And you can see we have a node swapper in here that handles the transition. And you can see some of the stuff you can do with the transition system in ProtoJam. You can edit these transitions to do whatever you want. We'll just reset that real quick. There we go. Okay, we'll probably change that to something else, but that's all application does, high level scene swapping. So that's kind of already implemented. And then the next thing is game itself. So if we come over here to scripts, game, all we're doing in here is I have some loading code. So we have a start function that loads the level asynchronously. That's just so that the loading screen will stay up while the game is loading. And then we're not really doing any other game setup. We also have this mouse mode controller under game that will just grab the mouse and make it locked so that you can do 3D. So that's what we've got so far. So let's talk about what this game is going to be. So we'll just come over here and we'll just do notepad for this. Sorry if it flashbanged anyone. I'll try to drag that a little off screen. All right. And I'm going to bring that up a bit so we can see what we're doing. Okay. So we're going to start with the mind map. This is how I always like to start if I'm doing a jam or whatever else. And then we're going to get into the player archetypes, which are like the abilities or features of the player. And then we're going to get into the challenge archetypes. These are the things that the player archetypes are made to counter. Or you can think of it as the challenge archetypes or individual things that you're trying to test the player on. And then we'll just do the high level design, which is just the general notes of how the game's going to work. Okay, so mind map. Right off the bat, or actually let me add an additional thing here. We are going to do restrictions on this because we have to keep, one, the best ideas come from limitations, and two, I don't want this to go on and be a never-ending project, so we got to put some limits on it. I'm going to say right off the bat, I am not going to spend more than a week working on this game because I just don't have the time for it. I might not do it every day, but a week total. So 1 week. I'm going to do one player. We're not going to do multiplayer. We're not going to worry about it. In terms of assets, I debated about this. Obviously the game's going to need some kind of assets. I have equipment to do music in sound effects production, but I'm not a musician. I am not a composer. I don't think that's going to go well. I mostly have them as a hobby. So I'm probably going to have to pull in some kind of assets, and especially if I want to get this done in a week by myself. So I think we're going to have to do some external assets, but because this is going to be part of an open source project, I can't include, you know, like Pizza Doggy assets that are paid. I don't know if they have any that are Creative Commons or MIT or something that's compatible, but I don't want to worry about including stuff that, you know, it should not be included. It's licensed against it. So I'm going to say CC0 or OFL assets only. If you're not familiar, CC0 is just Creative Commons 0. It's not technically public domain. There's some legalities around that, but it's as close as you can get. And OFL is the open font license, which is the more or less MIT/CC0 equivalent to for specifically for font files. And it's actually pretty easy to find OFL stuff. I find that most any font you could want is under OFL. If you go to Google Fonts in particular and you find a font you like, you can check the license, and I would say like 9 times out of 10 it's an OFL license. You're usually good. The only caveat with OFL is that you need to include a copy of the license whenever you distribute it, as well as credit the person. I'd say it's closer to an MIT license than a CC0. But anyways, we're going to say only those assets, which basically means in my case that it's probably predominantly going to be Kenny assets, which is fine. I'm very familiar with those. I have a lot of Kenny assets. And in fact, I can actually bring this up now, and it hopefully isn't going to break everything like the one stream. So this is just my content browser. So I have a ton of stuff in here for Kenny. In fact, actually, this is outdated. I need to go download some of the updates to these packs. But I can just use anything I need from here. Now, I think I need a theme. So let's think about that. What would be a good theme to demonstrate ProtoJam's functionality? So if I pop open the README for ProtoJam, I think this will be helpful because this has the list of currently implemented features. State machine, there's a lot of things for that, but I'm kind of thinking I want some kind of character, if not an enemy, something that has some state. Player jumping has state, at least the way I do it. The one that stands out to me though is this item bob component. All that does is it makes an item hover up and down, like a very Banjo-Kazooie thing there. So something that hovers like that could potentially be good. Prototyping materials, I'm not going to worry too much about that. I don't need to showcase the prototyping materials. Mouse management is an important one. So that, like we saw in the scene, on the main menu, I have the mouse is free, and then when you hit play, it becomes captured. So that's making me think that I want this to be 3D. So I'm going to start to make some notes here. I'm going to say 3D first person, since that's really when you would be using mouse capture. Global music manager, yep, not a deal. Chainable health and damage framework. So the health and damage system in ProtoJam, I think is pretty cool. So if we come in here and we go to damage, and we'll say, we'll maybe do a hurt box as a good example. So ProtoJam has, I think, a very powerful system for handling damage for a couple reasons. One, damage is handled by layer. So the same way that collisions in Godot have a layer mask, ProtoJam has a damage mask. So you can have, and it's independent of the collision system. So you can, and in fact, not only that, it has two. So if we come in here to this damage generator, and then we go to the damage object, a damage object has an amount, which is just your how many hit points. Lethal, which means regardless of hit points, kill whatever it hits. That comes in very handy if you don't know, or if you're trying to do like a player boundary, like a kill boundary, or something like that. Or if you want to kill off an NPC for a script, you don't need to care. It avoids the issue of just 99999 hard-coded damage, and then players run into that one weird edge case where somehow you end up with enough armor or something that you can negate it. Lethal will always be lethal. So we have that, and then you have the source layer and type layer. So these are the masks I'm talking about. Source layer is who is dealing the damage, or what is dealing the damage. That could be that maybe every player is allocated to a different layer. It could be that different weapons are on different layers. It could be that you assign different layers to different factions. But what it means is that a health component or a hitbox has a source layer, or a source mask. If the damage is from a source layer that is not in that mask of the thing that it's trying to damage, then it won't receive damage from it. So that's really good if you want to prevent, say, friendly fire. You put the player or the players in, say, source layer 1, and you put the enemies in source layer 2, and on all the players, their mask includes layer 2, so they can receive damage from the enemies, but you uncheck layer 1, so they can't receive damage from themselves. And the beauty of this is that it only needs one collision layer to work. All the damage, all the projectiles and everything are just running on one collision layer, but the damage is being filtered internally by the damage framework using this different set of layers. And then the secondary system is this type layer. So in addition to having source layers for what did the damage, you can also have a type of damage. So for instance, if you want to have type invulnerability to fire, water, whatever, you can say, well, layer 1 is going to be physical damage, layer 2 is fire, layer 3 is water, layer, whatever is ice. You can do that. And it's the same thing. Unless the system has a type mask that includes that layer, it won't receive damage from it. So right off the bat, the damage system in ProtoJam is built in to support very complex types of damage. On top of that, if we come up here, we have this damage generator. So damage doesn't just have to be a static object. You can dynamically generate damage using this or I don't want to say abstraction layer. That's not quite the right word. Pulling up a blank for what this is, but this is a interface that lets you generate damage on demand, which is good if you want to have it based on some statistic or you want to randomize it, whatever. The default ProtoJam ships with a static damage generator, which is just a resource that you hard code in how much damage you want to deal, what type mask or what type layers, what source layers, whether it's lethal damage. So we've got that. And then you go a level up, there's also a damage mutator. So this allows you to do things like multiply the damage for type weaknesses. Basically, it can inspect the damage and then modify it before it's received. So you can temporarily handle type invulnerabilities. You can cut it by a certain percentage if the player has armor, whatever you want to do. So we got quite a bit there. And then the big thing with this system is it's chainable. So Hurtbox has a parent, a damage parent, and you notice it's just a node. What this will do is if it receives damage, it can send that damage up to something else. So a Hurtbox on its own, it doesn't have health. It just is a thing that can receive damage. But as long as the node you specify has an apply damage function, it can send it to that node. So the main use case would be a health component. So a health component can receive damage. And this, obviously, we talked about, it has its source mask, the type mask. You have a bunch of other stuff built in here, like iframes. So you can set your Hurtbox, and in fact, we can go into a level here. So I can come in here and I can do a Hurtbox, and then a Hurtbox needs a damage box as a child, and then that needs a collision box, or a collision shape, I should say. We'll just set that to, I don't know, a box, whatever. So now this on its own isn't really going to do anything. And here's the other thing. ProtoJam has a lot of built-in warnings. It's really easy to do this, but it will say you have to have a damage generator. Or sorry, this is a, that's the wrong thing. I didn't want a Hurtbox. Hurtbox is deal damage. I wanted a hitbox. So we'll grab that. We'll just move this stuff. under it instead. There we go. So right now, this isn't going to do anything. You can see by default, it has source mask is everything, type mask is everything, and it looks like it's unset, but collision layer is set to the last layer. Right now, that could be hit by something, but it's not going to have an effect. You can't kill a hitbox. But if I come in here and I add a health component, then you can see the health component also has a source mask, a type mask, and this is a little more specific, so I can be a little more intentional with what kind of damage I want to receive. And then all I have to do to connect it is go down to the hitbox and hit assign on the damage parent and select the health component. And there we go. Now, if this hitbox takes damage, it will forward that damage to the health component, and the health component will die. It will trigger its iframes. It will emit signals to say it's been killed, whatever else. But here's the really cool part about this system. The health component can then forward it up again. So this would be if you want to have a boss enemy, for example, that has destructible body parts. Like maybe you have to shoot its arms, its legs, its head, like a reverse Exodia. You can give a health component to each arm, each leg, the head, and then the enemy as a whole can have a central health bar. That's what you know, maybe is at the top of your screen. And if you forward the damage from each of the child components, then if the player hits the arm, then the arm will take damage, and then it'll forward that damage up to the main health bar. And then once the arm eventually dies, its health component dies, then you have to go deal damage to a different part of the body. So it lets you do that kind of thing. You can just keep chaining the damage. And I used that in Skyjacker for the Godot Wild Jam. There was a level with 2 objectives, and the enemies could kill either one of the objectives, but only when both objectives died would the level end. And the way I did that was chaining the damage. There was a central health component that represented both of the objectives, and each of the objectives was just forwarding their damage up to it. So that's how it knew when both of them died. So that allows you to do a lot of really complex damage stuff without having to do any coding at all. You can just wire everything up using the buttons in the inspector. So I want to feature that in this game. So I want either chainable or type damage. Since I want to demonstrate that functionality because I think it's a really cool feature of the plugin. So the other things we've got, if we go back to the README on functionality to show off here, transition framework, that's pretty straightforward. That's already set up. I'm not going to worry about that. Commonly needed utilities, that's just like the quit gracefully. Don't really need to demonstrate that. Data-driven credits, that's going to come up anyways. Settings and save data management, that's a good one. Whatever this is needs to save some kind of data. Might be just a high score, might be upgrades, progress, whatever. ProtoJam has, that's what I actually just finished this morning, is a pretty nice system for handling save data. In fact, actually, there's a little bit of an example of it here. So high score data is a resource. So settings and save data in ProtoJam are represented as resources. So you go into these resources, and this one you can see is an integer save data. You give it a key. This is what's going to get stored into the save data file. You can specify, is this save data that's universal to the game? You know, like a achievement or a high score, something like that. Or is it something that's specific to a save file? If it's specific to a save file, then you leave global unchecked. And then the save system allows you to have an unlimited number of save slots, kind of like Resident Evil or something. And then, of course, you can have your default value, and there's other ones too. So you can come in here and you can do create resource. Oh, there they are right at the top. So save data. There's a few basic ones provided, strings, integers, floats, booleans. And then you can also create a custom implementation using abstract save data. The beauty is, all you have to do is create the resource. You don't have to register it anywhere. You don't have to do literally anything else with it. All you do is create the resource, and it's now being managed by the global save data system. I don't know if it is going to still be here. Oh, okay, it looks like it is. So if we come in here, you can see actually some of the stuff the save data system generated. we have a global JSON file, and then a slot 0 file, and then a last use slot. So the save system is pretty powerful. You can have multiple save slots, and it will remember which one you last used. So if you want to have a continue button, you can literally just tell the save system to load, and it will load whatever the last used slot was. So I think I'm going to actually save something to slots. So I want a game that has save slots in it. All right. And then background resource loading. Yeah, we're going to need to use that anyways. So I'm going to say these are my restrictions. And then we have the theme. So let's think about that. What would show all of this off? I debated throwing this into a random word generator, but I have an idea. This might be really dumb. I'm gonna have I know I'm gonna have people in the comments and they're gonna tell me I'm dumb. And you know what? They're 100% right, because I say I want to get this done in a week, and I don't. This is not the kind of genre you do in a week. If you've followed me for any amount of time, and I don't blame you if you haven't, because I don't post that often, there is an old game I really like called Riverworld. And in fact, I like it so much I made modding tools for it. It's a very interesting RTS because it allows you to be very fine-grained with what you're doing. And I have been looking for an excuse in every game jam I participate in to do that style of RTS again. Or not again, to make one in the same vein where you micromanage everything from a first-person perspective, which you don't always do that in Riverworld, but that's what I want to do. I think that's what I'm going to do. I think we're going to do a first-person RTS because it's a genre that almost nobody ever makes. And I think that's kind of disappointing because it's a really interesting genre, being on the front lines in the action, but simultaneously controlling a whole group of units. I think that's a neat idea. So I think that will allow us to show off all the functionality of ProtoJam. Obviously, we got the first person. The chainable damage system, I might have to be a little bit creative about how that gets worked in, but we'll think about it. The save slots, that makes sense. Most RTS games, or at least ones that I play, have save slots. So we'll stick to that. So then, we're going to throw in first-person RTS. Actually, that's not really a theme, I guess. But we'll say that's the mind map. Okay. So functionality-wise, what are we going to do? Let's tackle this chainable damage. So that could either be multi-part units. So we either have joint units that get damaged together, or maybe you capture territories and each individual unit drops the overall health of the territory, which possibly. It could also be something less gameplay related and more quality of life, where maybe if you exhaust all the resources from a territory, you can see like a bar graph that tells you how many resources are remaining. I actually kind of like that. I think that makes more sense for this. So we'll say you need to collect various resources from territory. That is going completely off the screen. Oh, wow, I cannot spell territory. I still can't spell check. You know what? Spell check. There we go. All right. So we're collecting resources from a territory. Obviously, that means we're going to have multiple levels of tech advancement. Going to go for a very Halo Wars-esque thing here. Well, maybe not Halo Wars, because I think it only has one type of resource. Something. So I'm thinking we're going to go for like, you know, wood, stone, metal, something like that. You collect it. Once you get enough, you can advance your tech, build new unit types, the typical thing. So we'll say multiple ages of tech based on resources. We'll actually throw that under there. Okay. So we're starting to get somewhere. Save slots, I don't really need to throw that in here. So then the first person aspect, I think we need to come back to that and think about how that's going to make sense in this game. So if you're in first person and it's an RTS, two things come to mind. One is, how are you, in a key aspect of an RTS is that you need to see the battlefield. You need to know what's going on. But games like Riverworld are interesting because you're simultaneously controlling one person, but you have a side view that shows you what's going on in the world. In fact, Riverworld actually has 3 of them. It's kind of bizarre, but I keep bringing that up just because it's a style I want to create. We're not literally going to try and recreate Riverworld here. So a couple interesting things with that. The way they get around it is kind of interesting because they basically give you 3 different mini maps that just show you what's going on. I think, and you can also change which character you're currently following. I don't think I want to go to that extreme, partially because I don't want to try and implement an ability to take control of any agent that's running around the game. So I think what we're going to say is that you personally have to go somewhere. And I think the challenge of the game is going to be that maybe the enemy is specifically targeting you, and that if you personally die, the game is over. So maybe it's not about destroying your buildings. It's not about destroying, taking ownership of something in the land, or, like a King of the Hill type thing. I think it's literally you have to get rid of the leader of the territory to win. So we're going to say that objective is eliminate territory, or we'll just say enemy / player leader. Okay, so then with that tells us a lot about what the gameplay is going to need to be. The core aspect of this game then is going to be protecting yourself. So you're going to need to build some kind of defenses. Emphasis on defense structures. So it's going to be less about, there's going to have to be some degree of offense, but my thought is the offense is going to be largely autonomous. So like you command people to go do something and they do, or maybe you plan an attack and they go off and do something. We might even be able to fake this a little bit too. If you can't leave your structure, like if you're in a castle, then planning an attack, maybe it's like you're on like a planning table and you plan the attack and you don't ever see what's actually happening. That could be an interesting approach. And that would mean that we can just use some math and curves and things to fake the outcome of battles and not have to actually worry about enemies path planning around. That could potentially help a lot. I will say one of the benefits of doing this is that since it's not actually a jam game, I'm not going to worry about running it in web. I might keep it in compatibility mode just because I find that helps to keep the retro look of a game, because you can't use some of the more advanced features of the renderer. But we'll see. So if the emphasis is on defense structures, I like the idea that you can't attack. So we're going to say you cannot attack. You're a leader, not a fighter. I think that's an interesting spin. So then the question is going to be, how do you command troops? Is it like, do you talk to somebody to do it? Are you using some sort of planning board? Are they just constantly attacking like an auto clicker and you're just maintaining resources? Personally, here's my thought. Coding an enemy AI, like the enemy leader AI, to be able to strategically attack you, I think is going to be difficult. A lot of RTS games, it's my understanding that they use something called an expert system, which is just basically a fancy word for a database of predetermined actions that they collected from watching actual people play the game. You watch an expert and then you codify what they did in certain scenarios, and then the enemy AI will just say, does the scenario apply? If so, perform this action that the human player would have done. The trick is, unless you have the time to watch somebody play the game and you've built the game in a way that's properly balanced to where that's even going to work, we're not going to have time for that. We only got a week. I'm going to say it probably makes more sense to go the clicker route. So you buy units or you upgrade units and they are just constantly attacking, and effectively it's just a numbers game. So I think I like that idea. So we're going to say that you just enemy units are, or units constantly attack, and maybe with a target. I guess it's a little bit like Halo Wars, but we're gonna say no. We'll say not individually. Well, okay. If they're not individually selected, that does kind of go against what I said I liked about Riverworld, which is that it is a very micromanaged game. Because I'm thinking about it, if the enemies are just constantly attacking, what are you doing while you're in first person? Unless you're the one building. You're a builder, not a fighter. We'll say that. Okay. So you're the one running around building everything. So maybe you have to constantly build units. Maybe you have to go collect resources yourself, unless you get units that can do it for you. Okay, I like where that's going. You can only collect resources and build. And you have to purchase units to automate it. Okay, so then I think we've got a good idea here, and I think I know I think I know what I want the theme to be, but I don't know that I'm going to be able to find very many assets that are going to work for this. So, but I'm thinking cardboard castles. Ever since I've ever watched the Simpsons episode where Bart and Lisa build the giant castle out of cardboard, I've had an obsession with cardboard. So my thought is that this is going to be like a very lighthearted game where it's like maybe kids on either side of a street have built cardboard battlements and are rushing across the street to try and capture the other castle. So maybe then the way it works is that you can run around and grab cardboard, maybe from fallen units, or maybe there's cardboard, maybe like a truck or something drives through the middle of the level and drops cardboard, like boxes fall off the back of a truck and you have to go pick it up. I think that could be fun. And then you have to bring those resources back and repair and build your base and construct units. I think that's a cool idea. So then maybe each side has, say, 3 allied units that you can control, and you can change their classification. So maybe you have like 3 other units with you, and you can either outfit them with weapons and tell them to go attack, or you can tell them to go collect resources for you. I will have to figure out how to make the enemy AI know how to balance that, but that can be a problem for future me to figure that out, so that it knows when to attack versus collect. And then the game is over if you get captured and you have no way of attacking personally. Or if you do have a way of attacking, it would be very, very light compared to an allied unit that attacks. I think I like that. I think that's a good idea. So construct buildings. We'll say construct walls, or yeah, probably just walls. Things that they're going to have to tear down to get to you. Maybe towers as well. That is going to make path planning a little bit complicated if we're going into a whole nother axis, but we can deal with that when it comes to it. I think then that's probably... And I guess the other thing would be collect resources to build, can assign units. We'll say must assign units to attack, limited number. Okay. I think that's a good plan then. I think we've got a good layout for what this game is going to be. So from the player archetypes, we're going to say, really all you can do is probably jump. And this is going to seem basic, but this is how I like to do this. We'll say collect. Well, honestly, it might even just be jump. or we'll say jump repair unit, or repair unit slash structure. Do that. And we'll say order reassign unit. And we'll say either collect or fight, or maybe guard. That could be a good one. Or maybe ranged. We'll say collect, range, or close. I'm gonna have to think about the balance of that, because if they're a ranged unit, they're gonna have to have lower damage, otherwise they'd be overpowered. If they're a close-up unit, or maybe we could say a fighter or demolitions. That maybe makes more sense. So fighter, demolition, and collection. That probably works better. So we'll say that all of them are just close range units, and that also is going to avoid complications with trying to do target leading and figuring out how on earth a cardboard-based RTS is going to involve weapons. We'll just say that they're cardboard swords. But okay, I think this makes sense. So the collection unit is just going to run around the battlefield and pick up whatever resources they can find and bring them back, the same as what you can do. The fighter is only going to target enemy units and try to take them out. And then the demolition unit is going to target enemy structures and try to blow them up. Or, I don't know, maybe they'll throw a bucket of water on it to make it turn into mush. Okay, I think that makes sense. So that's really all the player can do then. I guess you can also build structures. I'm going to have to get clever, I think, with how we're going to do the path planning for this, though. Because if you're building structures, you can do 3D path planning in Godot. But the problem is that if you're dynamically building structures, unless you're using a fixed grid, you're going to have to regenerate the nav mesh. And there's always that complication when you're doing any kind of building game with navigation of what happens if you build something that's unnavigable by the agents. You have to have some kind of failsafe, either cheating and just teleporting the agents where they need to go, or a specialized unit that can somehow deal with whatever the obstruction is. In our case, since they're all destructible, that might not be a major concern, but I am worried about towers. If we have towers, that might be problematic, because if you can just stand on top of a tower, then you never have to worry about anything hitting you. That's problematic. And if I allow you to do like Minecraft, where you can just place blocks on like a voxel grid, that's also going to be problematic, because then I have to figure out how to do path planning up a voxel grid. And I don't want to do that in a short period of time. It's definitely possible, but I don't want to worry about doing it. Because then you also have to deal with nonsense like players pillaring straight up and junk like that. So I'm going to have to be careful with what the limitations of the building system are. It may be more like Sanctum, for example, where there's only fixed places you can build things. Because Sanctum can get away with that because it can force you to always have a walkable path if the path is unbuildable. You're going to have like a 1 block wide path that's not, you can't place anything on it. And that's a good way to make sure that the units always have a path through. Okay, so then for the challenges, we basically have the same type of enemies. So we have collectors. So they gather or steal resources, but can't attack. So my thought is that when you pick up resources, like the cardboard, it's going to be like in both hands, so you can't do anything. We have the fighters, can attack, but can't do anything else. Can't damage buildings. And then demolition can only damage buildings. Okay, and I think that should work. So then the enemy strategy is basically just going to be choosing when to go out and collect something, when to build fighters, when to build demolition, and potentially deciding to try and group them up. So maybe reassigning all your demolition people to suddenly be fighters or something like that. There's going to have to be some system to force them to change. I have an idea on that. One thought is that I treat every unit like it's a weapon on your hotbar, and that you have to choose what to do with that unit. It could be too, because here's my thing. If a unit is a fighter and they go out and fight and then they die, or whatever the equivalent in this game is, do they respawn as a fighter and immediately take off and start attacking again? Or do they go back to like a staging area where they have to be remade? That's the question. Because if you have to remake them, then that's going to require the player to run around and constantly do something. So that's going to require like a spawn area that can't be built on, so that you can guarantee that your units can always... Oh, actually, you know what? That's a good balance. If you always spawn in the same location, then that means that you have to have a path out of your building, because if you don't, your units are never going to be able to fight the enemy units. They won't be able to get out. So that's a good way of handling that. So okay, I might also just make it so that you can't stand on anything. Maybe you can jump. I might just remove the ability to jump, frankly. But okay, so then if they spawn units respawn and must be reassigned, or we'll say, hold on, units must be reassigned when respawned. And that's also going to make it easy to keep track of needing to reallocate resources. So that also means for economy purposes, there can just be a fixed amount of resources in the level. If you need, say, tape and cardboard to make a unit, or maybe firecrackers as well, I don't know, then cardboard, for example, if it never gets destroyed, that could effectively be a fixed resource that only so much of it exists in a level, and you have to go out and recollect it. So we'll say that. So cardboard does not, or fixed limit on cardboard in level, and that's gonna like your base resource. All units require, I'll say also structures require cardboard to build. And I might do additional types like glue or duct tape or something. I think that could also be interesting, but this effectively limits the size of the, or it limits how involved the battle can be. Or we're gonna say fixed number of units per side. So it's gonna be like 5v5 or 7v7 or something like that. So you can't just spawn additional units. You have to just keep recycling the ones you've got. Units must be interacted with to reassign. So that kind of goes along with this. Okay. I think I've got enough to go ahead and get started on the implementation then. All right. So if we come over to here, that probably means that the level system can stick around if I want to have multiple levels. But the levels are going to be more like maps, not levels. And I think I'm going to do a similar system to what I did for Skyjacker and make not a map, but some kind of resource that represents everything there is about a level. So like how frequently items drop, how many enemies are on it. What would I call that? Not a mission. I guess it could be a map, but I kind of want to allow different settings per map. So let's come in here into scripts. I guess I'll just put it under game. So we're gonna make a new script. What would I call that? A game mode? Not really. An encounter might make more sense to call it an encounter. Yeah, I think we're going to go with that. And we might change this later. But we'll just call it an encounter. We're going to do this as a resource. Trying to think of a better name for that. A skirmish. But we'll do class name encounter. Okay, and I'm not going to worry about documentation for this right now. I can come back and clean that up later because I'm not even 100% certain if I'm going to keep it this way. But first things first, we're going to need to know which map it needs to load. So we're going to do map path, and we're not going to do a packed scene. If you want to do background loading, and I'll always harp on this, if you want to load anything asynchronously in Godot, do not use its actual type. Don't use a packed scene. Don't use an image. Don't use a stream. You want to use a path. It is totally fine to load things from a path, especially in modern versions of Godot that can use UIDs that are not going to change if you move the resource somewhere. The reason for that is that when you use a packed scene or one of the other resource types, Godot is going to load that thing right then and there as soon as it's referenced. So this encounter object, as soon as something references it, it is going to go load those things. That is going to mean that you don't have asynchronous loading, you don't have background loading, you have loading that is going to block your game while it goes and does that. That's why I say whenever you want to load something asynchronously, use the path. It's a little messy. You don't have the type protections that you have when you're using one of the resource types, but if you want to do it asynchronously, always go with the path to it instead. So we'll stick with that. And for now, I think that's all we need. I might add something for like background music. In fact, actually, yeah. Well, yeah, let's go for that. Let's add background music. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to do a string. And then I'm going to create an instance of that down here. We're going to create a new folder and we'll say encounters. And then in here, we will just create an instance of a resource this time, encounter. And we'll just call this test encounter. And then over here, we need to assign it. Now, if I change this export to a file and give it a filter of TSCNs, then this is how you can make sure that you can only select that right thing, and it'll give you the nice button in the editor. So we'll do that. Go into scenes. I'm going to rename that to something else, but for now we'll select that. And then same thing here. We'll do file. And since really if you're doing a game in Godot, your music should be in an OGG format, there's a few situations where you might use MP3. I can't think of a good reason to do it, but you might need to under very specific circumstances, maybe in a web build. But even then, it's kind of a weird trade-off because OGG, the trick to OGG and MP3 is that OGG is much more compressed. So it takes up a lot less space, but it's significantly more processor intensive to actually play it back because of the compression. MP3 is much less compressed, which means it takes up way more file space, like way more, but it's not as difficult for Godot to actually play it back. And I've noticed web builds do seem to struggle a bit when they're playing OGG files. So that might be the one edge case where you may want to use MP3 instead of OGG for your music. You never want to use WAV though for your music files, because they technically are compressed, but it's so little compression that the file is going to be absolutely massive. They're the most efficient thing to play back, which is why Godot's documentation says to use them for sound effects, because they're extremely cheap to play. You can play hundreds of the things, maybe even thousands simultaneously. It's not difficult because of the way they're encoded. But for anything that's even remotely long, like 15, 20, 30 seconds, you're gonna have a massive file, which will take forever to load, and it's not a good idea. So let me see, where do I have? It would be under resources, music. Don't remember which one of these is which. Hey, how you going? Oh yeah, I remember you. C# Player's Guide. I have not heard of that one. Is that, yeah, I do remember having that because we talked about that. Is that one specific to any engine, or is it like a general, hey, if you're a game dev and you're using C# kind of thing? I'm curious. I have a whole collection of, I think I mentioned that to you last time. I've got a whole collection of game development books, so I'm kind of curious about that one. I have not done C# in forever, and I know that one of these days I'm going to make a game complex enough in Godot that I need to start using C#. Oh, general C#. Oh, nice. I might have to keep that one in mind then. I'm glad you found something that was good. Yeah, today, not working on a jam, but I am working on a add-on for Godot that's kind of a quick start add-on to do a lot of the basic functionality that you need. Or really, I should say the add-on is almost done, and I am making a example game to showcase the functionality of it. So we just got through with the ideation, planning out what kind of game this is going to be, and starting to get into the implementation. RB Whitaker, okay. Now I have to keep that in mind. I've got a list. In fact, actually, I think somewhere over here I have a list of... where is that? There we are. Yeah, let me add a note for that. Yeah, I have a list of authors from some of the Game Programming Gems books and some of the interesting things that they've done. Just kind of curious about their process in particular, so I'll keep them on the list. I forget, were you working on a game of your own, or were you just getting started and just learning about it? And let's see, game, I'm going to need to change this to actually take an encounter object, not just a level path. We'll say start an encounter. There we go. Okay. So then load level, we need to do encounter dot map path, and we'll say load map instead. Just getting started. Nice. Yeah, I think when I got started, I think it was in like 2008, and I started with Multimedia Fusion, and then I did a little bit of stuff in C++. That did not go very well. And then I eventually moved over to Unity when I was doing a game development course in school, or a game design course, I should say. And I used Unity for a little bit. I did a couple of projects in it, but that was a really old version of it. I can't even remember what version it was. It was before they had the entity component system. I know that because I remember reading blog posts about it, and from what I understand, it's changed like 6 times since then. That was the most I wanted at the time when I was doing Unity. I wanted to do a game similar to Amnesia. So I have a different channel, an old one that I don't really use anymore, where I had videos showcasing the like interaction system and like screen shake and things like that, like where I was trying to make reusable nodes that you could drop into a level to trigger screen shake, and I was trying to create the valves like Amnesia has, where you need to click on the valve and drag with your mouse to spin it. I ended up abandoning that idea though, because funnily enough, the game I was trying to make was an underwater game themed after Amnesia, and I kid you not, like 3 or 4 months after I started that, they announced Soma. And I was like, dang it, you guys are going to end up making a way better version of what I wanted to make. And they did. It was awesome. Yeah, have you ever played that? Because if not, I will highly recommend it. Yeah, that is a great game. that I learned my lesson about not trying to copy the style of another game, because inevitably the studio that made that game might make another one. Now let's see. So I think we're gonna say load map. Let's see. We'll change all this. Just Control F map in here. All right. Yeah. So I don't know if you caught the ideation part of the stream, but I'm trying to make an RTS that is basically like a whimsical cardboard, like kids building cardboard forts and battling each other. But the trick is it's going to be an RTS that's entirely in first person. So you have to run out and collect the resources in the field, and you have to walk up to and manually reassign units whenever they respawn. So the idea is like that, like you're outfitting like neighbor kids in like cardboard armor and giving them cardboard swords, and they're running out to go fight for you, and then if they lose, they come running back, and you have to like go get duct tape and cardboard and make them new armor. And then the game is going to be over if one of their fighters comes and gets you. So it's like tag basically with cardboard forts. And I'm going to try to do some basic building mechanics where you can use the cardboard to either outfit your units to respec them, or you can build like battlements to protect yourself. Because it's ultimately going to be, if they catch you, it's game over. And if you catch them, it's game over. So that's the plan. We'll see how feasible that is. I'm going to try to get this done. I don't know if it's going to be a continuous week of streams, but I'm going to spend no more than a week of actual development time on this, since it's just meant to be an example game. Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, I get that too about the horror games. I'll be honest, every one of them, every one of the Amnesia games, the Soma games, the Penumbra games, all of them that Frictional made, they always tell you, for the best experience, turn off the lights and put on the headphones. I cannot. I tried it. Cannot do it. I have to play with the lights on. But I do enjoy horror games. But I will admit, the jump scares are... They do kind of get grating after a while, even for me. Yeah, like Codename. Yeah, so funnily enough, what popped into my head was there's an episode of The Simpsons where Bart and Lisa build like a cardboard fort, and then they go to war with like UPS or FedEx or something, and that's kind of what I'm visualizing. But yeah, I can definitely see the K&D as well. I'm probably not going to go as deep into the building mechanics. If I did, it probably would start to resemble K&D quite a bit. But since it is an example game, I'm probably going to keep the units you can construct and the resources limited. I was saying at the start that this is kind of inspired by an old RTS game called Riverworld, that basically nobody played, but I love it, and I made modding tools for it. So and that's where the first person micromanagement of things comes from, is that's how Riverworld worked, is you controlled one person who had to physically run around and talk to people, and command them to go do things, with an asterisk. Technically you could also go into free cam mode, but that's never how I played it, at least. Okay, so I've been staring at this class for a minute. Let me rename some stuff here. So we're going to do test map, and then we're going to come over here, rename that as well. Say maps. I don't know if there is going to be more than one map, but we're going to start with that. Okay. All right, so now the system should be... Oh, no, I broke something. What did I break? Ah, yes, I'm not loading the map. All right, so we'll grab a reference to that. Or actually, I need to grab a reference to the encounter now that I think about it. Now, I was saying earlier that if you want to do asynchronous loading in Godot, you do not want to use the type of something. You don't want to use stream. You don't want to use packed scene or whatever, because it forces Godot to load it right then and there with a preload. But in this case, the encounter object itself just stores strings. So it's totally fine to preload that, because it's not going to take very long. Then that will get passed off to the game class I was just looking at, that will actually do the background loading. It'll grab the string and pass it to the background loader, so that the loading screen can sit there and spin while it's loading the actual big part of the data. So down here we have level path. Okay, so that needs to change. We're going to say encounter, and we're going to call that encounter. Okay, specifies the encounter. I'm debating whether or not encounters should actually be a resource, or if this is something that should get created dynamically from like game settings. Like you go in and you choose your map or whatever. For now, I'm going to keep them pre-programmed because it's going to make testing easier. But we can come back and change that. It's just basically changing the type of the class from resource to ref counted. Okay, so we'll come in there and we'll say that. I'm also going to ditch this documentation. I don't want to worry about having outdated documentation in my code. We'll go clean that up later. Okay, so now I think Let's see, switch to game. Where am I calling that? Ah, there it is. I still have a reference. Ditch that. So we'll do test encounter. Yeah, we'll chuck that in there. Okay, let's try this out. See if that works any better this time. Yeah, there we go. Now it's loading again. Nice. I'll have to come up with... I'm kind of thinking for the... I'm trying to think about what I want the transition for this to be. I don't think I want to go with just a basic fade or sweep or something. I'm kind of thinking, since we're going the whimsical route, maybe like a cardboard box that's opening. Like you're looking at the top of it and you're opening the cardboard box. Don't know how I'm going to animate that though. Art is not my strong suit. I need to practice it more. I might have to think about... I might even just do it in 3D, honestly. And just do a rendered viewport. Well, we'll see. Okay, so we've got the test encounter loading. So we're going to need a player controller so we can actually move around and do something. And a player controller is going to need a camera controller. So let's start with that. Let's see, where's... Okay, here we go. Let's do a player camera. And, oh no, I want to create a folder first. We'll just call this player. And we will say player camera. And there we go. And we'll make that a node 3D. And then inside of it, we're going to do a camera 3D. Do .new. And we'll need to add some settings for this. So this will be a good time to demonstrate some of the functionality of the plugin. But I think the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go shamelessly steal some of the code from one of my game jams to bootstrap this. So let's see, Skyjacker might work. Yeah, that's probably the best one to steal the code from. All right, so let's see, what do we got? I think it would be under scripts. Yeah, here we are. So player camera. Yeah. Nobody look. I'm stealing code from myself. Okay, so there we go. This has a bunch of junk in it I don't really want. So we'll get rid of the stuff for boosting because this is not a space fighter. All right. We have same things there. We got that. Boost, multiplier, boosting. Don't care. Don't care about the camera shake right now. We'll add that back in later. Field of view setting. We will keep that. Yep. Ditch all of that. And... wow, like everything in here was for boosting and shaking. Maybe that wasn't as good to copy. All right. There we go. So we have the field of view setting. So this is the benefit of ProtoJam, is that all of the game settings are resources. So I can just come into here under settings and I can create a new resource. And I can say a range setting, and we'll call this field of view setting. And then in the settings, I can set the min value. I don't know, we'll do like 60 degrees. We'll set the max to, I don't know, 120. We'll set the step value to like 5-degree increments, and we'll set the default value to like 90. And then we'll just call the setting field of view. It's difficult typing when there's a microphone between you and the keyboard. So like that setting will now just be automatically registered. So I don't need to do anything to make that work. All right, so then in here, we have this shake container, not gonna worry about that. We'll just ditch that and we'll just grab camera. We'll add that instead. Out of force of habit, I just add everything as internal. For Godot, you can choose to add nodes as, I don't know what the opposite of internal is. What do they call it? I guess just internal mode disabled. You can add them as internal or not. All it does is that when you call get children by default, that won't include internal. So making stuff internal also means that it won't show up under the scene tree. It's really only useful if you're writing a custom node type and you don't want its children that it manages to show up and for people to reference them. That's really the only reason you do it. So in this case, I don't want people to have direct access to the camera, or really I don't want me to forget that I shouldn't have direct access to the camera. So making it internal just means that it will be harder to do that. So we'll ditch that. Update field of view. I'm not going to do that in process. I'm actually going to change where that lives. So we'll deal with that in a second. We'll get rid of this code as well. Wow. All of that I copied, and this is the only part I needed. Okay, so target FOV equals 1, whatever. Wait, I'm not going to worry about that. Yeah, okay. We literally just going to do this. Cool. Oh, I love when that happens. You copy the code and find out that you didn't need any of it. I might have to do some adjustments there. And it's occurring to me now that actually the code I was thinking of was the player input code, because that's where the sensitivity for the sticks and the mouse would be. They wouldn't be in the camera itself, because I use a separate node for player input, because then you can attach that player input to anything, not just one character. You can attach it to a vehicle or something. So okay, my brain was fried there. All right, so what I said I wanted to do though is I don't want to just update this in process, and the reason for that is that if you pause the game and then you go into the settings and you try to change the field of view, it won't actually change until you unpause the game. And you know, if your settings menu is opaque and you can't see the game while you're in it, that's fine, it doesn't matter. But I like to do semi-transparent settings menus specifically so that you can see the change being applied as you're applying it. So if you use a process function, that's not going to work, because process won't get called while you're paused. The alternative is that these settings will emit a signal. You have to go to the abstract setting, but they emit a value change signal anytime they change. And that doesn't care if your game is paused. So in here, we are going to subscribe to that signal. And whenever it gets fired, we will just update the field of view. And then that way, as somebody is moving the slider in the settings menu, the player camera will just be updating itself automatically. The trick to that is you have to add in some protections. And you see this, if you look at ProtoJam's code, you see this pattern all over the place. It gets a little messy when you're dealing with these properties, but there's a chance that someone, i.e. me, might try to reassign the same setting to itself. So you just say, you know, setting equals the same thing. And if you do that and you try to resubscribe to the signal, you're going to get an error because Godot won't let you resubscribe to the same signal twice. So you have to add in some code to make sure that you're not trying to resubscribe to the same thing. You also have to make sure if the value is null that you don't try to dereference the null to get the signal. So the setters can get a little bit hairy sometimes in Godot when you actually want to write them properly. And obviously none of this is a problem if you're never going to call it that way, but I always try to write the code assuming that I'm going to forget how it works and do something stupid later. So first things first, we need to say is if value, or if really null, does not equal value. I always prefer to put a literal first, so that if I accidentally typo it and do that, it won't actually try to overwrite the value. That's just good programming practice in general. If you're ever comparing something against an enum or a value, put the value first, because you can't assign to a value in most any programming language. And it'll save you from really silly mistakes, like if you accidentally intend to do value does not equal null, and you somehow screw it up and accidentally do that. This will evaluate, well, that will probably evaluate to false, but now you've accidentally changed value to null, and now you're going to have a weird bug in your game where your setting never works, or whatever it is doesn't work properly because you accidentally assigned over it when you didn't intend to. Okay, so then the next thing we need to do is if the setting dot value changed has or is connected, and we're going to say if it's connected to update field of view, or sorry, we're going to compare against the setting currently. So if we are changing this to a different setting, we need to unsubscribe from the original setting, or else if it gets changed, we're going to get called. the likelihood of that happening, there being 2 settings for field of view, is very, very low, but I want to try and, 1, be defensive in the programming, and 2, this is an example project of how you're intended to use the library, and I don't want to cut corners and write it in a way that people may be copying from and then getting weird bugs in their code because they didn't do something, or because I didn't do something because I knew it wasn't possible, and they copy it and then it is possible. That's just the nature of it. I've been doing software development long enough that I know that people can and will copy the code even if it's a bad idea to do it. I mean, look at me. I literally just copied my own code 30 seconds ago and deleted 90% of it. So, or 3 minutes ago, whatever. Okay, so if the old value of the setting is not null and it is still connected, then we need to disconnect it. So we'll disconnect. That's the first step. Second step is if the new value is not null, then we need to connect it. And since we're guaranteeing that we're always going to disconnect it whenever we change, we don't need to check if we're accidentally reconnecting it twice. But we do just need to do, or actually what we can do in here is we can, we'll do our assignment now. So we'll do that equals the value. So this now contains the new value. So we can do the same check, but it's against the new value now. And we'll just do value changed dot connect, and we'll connect it to this update function. All right, so that should be good. The other thing we do need to do though is immediately call the update function, because this signal will only get emitted when the setting changes. So it's not going to get emitted right away, so we need to manually call it. And then the one other thing we can do, this is more of an optimization, but if this setting equals the value, so if you're trying to assign it to itself, just immediately return. There's no reason to. Don't go through the trouble of disconnecting and reconnecting the signal if it's just going back to the same place. You could leave this out and it would work fine. In fact, to be honest, this probably has negligible performance impact. As like I said, this is very unlikely to even happen. But just for my sake, I'm going to leave it in. This really would only matter if this update function does something that you don't want to happen when it shouldn't. If this is an expensive function to call, then you would want to make sure you have this guard in there just to make sure that it doesn't get called unnecessarily. But now we should have the player camera working. I don't yet have a player object though. So we're going to come into here and we're just going to drop this into the map. And since it's a script, we can just use add instead of instantiate. And we will just grab player camera, chuck it in there. We do have to assign the resource, so we'll do the field of view setting. And I'm going to ditch that camera. Let's see, where is player camera? It's over here. So we'll just move it up and back, put it back there just so that we can see something whenever it spawns in. All right, there we go. All that code and it doesn't actually do anything different, but we've got the framework set up. So if I open the game settings, so if I go into the data folder and we just open the settings manually, I can type in here field of view, and I can put a value in here like 120. I can save that, and now if I launch the game, you can see the field of view is different. And same thing if I go back in, and I change it again to 60, and now I launch the game. Now the field of view is different again. Maybe not super obvious against the grid floor, but that is because ProtoJam is taking care of all of that for us in the background. So specifically in the main, we have this load settings, and all that's doing is calling settingsmanager.load settings, and that's the beauty of it. That's all you have to do. I didn't have to register this field of view anywhere. You don't have to register it with a global class. Just the fact that it exists, it will self-register itself with the settings manager, and if its key exists in the settings file, then it will automatically update the value. And and invoke that signal for value changed and all that. Very, very easy system to work with. I don't know how a lot of other Godot plugins handle settings, but this is how I chose to do it, and I really like it, because it also means that you don't have to worry about like hard-coded enums or ranges or synchronizing your user interface to the range of your setting, because all of that is just data-driven on this resource object. Your UI can just read the constraints, you know, the min value, max value, step value of the resource. You can do the same thing like I did with the player camera. You can make a widget that takes a reference to the setting object or the setting resource, and you can have it automatically configure itself to the bounds. It makes it so much easier to deal with settings as opposed to going in and like manually creating UI elements and connecting signals to every UI element to go update whatever value in your auto load for your settings or something. I think that's alone just the setting system, I think, is one of the biggest pros of using ProtoJam. But then again, I wrote it, so of course I'm going to say that. Okay, so now we need to make the player object. I did a script for the camera because there's not really a good reason to have a scene that just contains a camera in it. But for the player, we're probably going to want some other stuff attached to it. And you could construct it programmatically in code, but it's actually slower to construct it in code than it is to load it from a scene file, because the part of the engine that loads the scene files is in C++, and it has direct access to the engine's core components, whereas anything you write in GDScript has to go through multiple layers of interfaces, basically, to talk to the engine. Even though it looks like you're talking to it directly, it has to be, you know, go through, I don't know, probably function tables or something to go do it. I don't know how exactly GDScript is implemented, but it's not a direct access. It just isn't really possible in most languages. Okay, so we're going to make a new scene. We're going to probably make this a character body. I could do... I don't think there's a good reason to try and do it as a rigid body. I've done main characters that are rigid bodies. You can do it. Conventional wisdom tells you it's a bad idea, and I can agree with that. It's almost always a bad idea to do that, because inevitably you'll run into a situation where you just want the player to do something, and you have to do a bunch of crazy math to calculate the exact correct impulse to apply to the rigid body to make it do what you want. Whereas if you do a character body, you can just set the velocity and you're done with it. It does mean that certain physics interactions are more difficult, but that's the trade-off you get. And I've done this, I've had this fight with myself enough times that I've come to the realization that it's easier to make a character body and to hack it to behave like a rigid body than it is to start with a rigid body and try to hack it to behave like a character body. And that's, I don't expect anyone to believe me, and I'm sure people are going to do it anyways, and I think it's just one of those things that you have to just learn. You're inevitably going to do it. Nothing anybody can tell you will stop you from doing it, but you'll do it, and then eventually you'll learn not to do it anymore. There's a reason people will say all over Godot forums, don't do that, it's a bad idea, and people do it anyways, myself included. Unless you're doing something like an arcade racing game. Ironically, that's actually one of the few times where you do want to use a rigid body, because arcade racers are usually implemented. They don't actually simulate the wheels like you'd think. There's actually just a giant invisible sphere, and whenever you apply throttle, you're actually just rotating that sphere. And then the car is actually just a mesh that they've attached to the sphere, and they've configured it to not inherit its rotation. And that's how you make an arcade racer feel. You get that kind of floaty, drifty controls. It's because you're actually piloting a giant ball. They just make it look like it's not a ball by adding a car mesh to it instead. It's really funny that that's how that's usually implemented. Now let's see, where possible, I think I usually go for like 0.3 on the radius of my players. 2 meters is crazy tall. I don't know why Godot defaults, well, it's probably because this isn't really intended specifically for players, but I find that it is easier if you try to keep your height units consistent with real world objects where you can. It just makes it easier when you get into doing 3D modeling or really anything else. So since we're talking about this being like kids doing, fighting, I don't know what, let me open the calculator. What is, I don't know, how tall is a kid? Like what, 4 feet? I don't know. I don't remember. It's been too long since I was a kid. I don't remember how tall I was. What is 4 feet? That is, what is that in meters? It's gonna be like 1 meter, isn't it? Yeah, 1.2. Okay, whatever. We'll do like, we'll just simplify it down. We'll say 1 meter. Wow, that is, okay, that is much shorter than I thought. Maybe we'll do like 0.25. There we go. All right, and then I generally like to try and keep the feet of my players on the origin because it makes spawning them simpler. So we're going to move this capsule up 1 meter tall, so we need to move it up 0.5. There we go. And then in here we will add the player camera, and we're going to move that up, and we need to make sure we keep it within the boundary of the capsule, because if the near clipping plane of the camera gets outside of the player's bounding box, then it will be capable of phasing through geometry. And especially in a game like this where you're going to be going indoors inside like a box fort, the likelihood of that happening would actually be pretty high. So I need to make sure of that. So let's see, this thing is, let's see, what do I need to move up, like 0.75? Yeah, all right. So that way it is exactly centered on the bottom of this hemisphere at the top of the capsule. Unfortunately, whenever you do custom node types, you can't see the camera anymore, so I'm just going to have to hope that the clipping plane is fitting inside that. Unless you want to draw debug geometry, but it's actually kind of hard to do that in Godot. I remember that being one of the things that Unity did a little bit better. I remember they had better functions to draw like just lines and wireframe geometry on your custom types. And I forget what they were called. They're not nodes in Unity, but I remember it, at least the version I used, had a lot better facilities for that. Godot doesn't really have great options for drawing debug geometry. Usually your best bet is to dynamically, you can detect if you're running in the editor. So in your code, you have to detect, am I in the editor? And if so, dynamically add a mesh instance to the scene as a child and assign this mesh. And, usually you have to dynamically change the mesh using like an array mesh. And it's kind of a whole ordeal. I vaguely remember there just being basic draw commands in Unity that you could use. Hopefully they haven't changed that, because it was one of the good things about it. So we're going to say, we're just going to make a folder called player for now. We're going to drop this in there. And we're going to go ahead and add a script. Actually, one other thing, let me go ahead and set up my layers before I forget. So in here on our collision layers, we're going to put the player on layer 2. In fact, actually, we'll probably just call this units, actually, instead of player. Because I don't think I need, maybe we'll change that. We'll keep the player on a separate physics layer just in case, for some weird reason, I need units to be able to move through something or not move through something that the player can. I've got plenty of layers, so it's not like I'm going to run out. And then usually I make layer 1 static colliders. So those are just things that block everything. Or let me just call this blocking. And then usually I'll have, if I'm doing any kind of projectile weapons, I'll usually have an additional layer that's non-blocking geometry, which is kind of a weird concept. I haven't come up with a better name for it, but non-blocking geometry in my games usually refers to like an invisible wall that you can't go through, but you can shoot through. So that's usually things like map boundaries, because otherwise it would be weird if you shot and a bullet just hit a random part in space and suddenly left a bullet hole. That's usually why I end up doing that. Or I'll allow the camera to go through non-blocking geometry, but the player cannot. So I use that in third-person games sometimes, so that the camera doesn't try to snap around like really thin poles. I'll make them non-blocking so that the Camry, the Toyota Camry, no, the camera won't try to snap around thin things like fences or poles, but the player can't walk through them because the camera will be set to not consider them as solid. That's just a tip for if you're doing third-person cameras. That's something you're probably going to need. Although I believe Godot has some add-ons specifically for doing third-person cameras that are probably a little more advanced than that and might have better capabilities for dealing with that. So we are going to grab, let's see, in our player script, we'll grab a reference to the player camera, as I'm going to need that for something. And we'll go ahead and throw the physics process function in here, but we'll just set that to pass for the moment. Because now I am going to need that player input class. And I also need to make sure I set this. So player is layer 2, and they're going to collide with layer 1, which is blocking geometry. Or actually, one other thing. I'm going to put a ready in here. This may be controversial in Godot, but when you have a root node in your scene that's something complex, like a character body, you can go into the inspector and you can change all these settings, and if you instantiate this scene, the settings will be set to that. I find that that is really confusing, having to set, say some of the stuff in the inspector and then some of it elsewhere, because let me show you why this can get messy. So okay, on our test map, let's instantiate a player. All of the settings from the root node are here. So what can happen is if I'm in my player scene and on my collision layer, I say that they're on layer 2 and they can collide with, layer 1 and layer 3, and maybe layer 2 as well. Okay, I come into test map. These are set like that. Okay. Where this causes me a lot of confusion, and I have gotten a lot of heartache during game jams in the past, is that at some point during the jam, I will say, oh, I don't want the player to collide with enemies. I've actually decided that that causes problems. I'm going to change that. And inevitably what happens, it's the wrong thing to do, but it happens, is I will accidentally go into an instantiated copy of the scene, like the copy in this map, and I'll uncheck that box. And then I'll go in, I'll instantiate another copy of this somewhere else, and it doesn't work. And the reason why it doesn't work is because if I instantiate a new copy here, it's not set. It's only set on this copy. Because I didn't change it in the root scene, in the actual packed scene, I changed it on an instance of the scene. And that has happened to me so many times in game jams and things like that, that I have made a rule for myself that the root node of an object, where possible, should be a node or something like that that has no settings on it. Because if I come in here and I just add node, there's some stuff in here you can change, but there's very little that you're likely to change. That's a little bit more difficult to do with a player. Technically you can, but there's problems. So I don't like, with players, you can't really do that as well. So what I do instead is in my ready function, which is called whenever this thing gets added to the scene tree, in there, I will change the settings of the root node. That way, if I accidentally change them on an instance of it somewhere, they will get immediately unset when the ready function is called. So it's like a fail safe to make sure that I can only change it from one place, and I can't I can't screw it up and end up cursing myself out. That is probably unintuitive because every other thing on here doesn't have the same risk. I can change its settings. It's just the root node I do that with. So I'm sure for some people that's really unintuitive and very confusing, and they probably would never want to do that. But I find that that's, for me, a good fail safe. So that also does mean too, though, that you can restrict what stuff actually gets exposed. So that's actually part of the reason why my damage component, which actually I do need to add an instance of now I think about it, hitbox, it is not an instance of an area 3D. Effectively, that's what it does, but it's not an instance of area 3D. Because if I exposed the area 3D settings, then someone would be able to change them and break the functionality of the hitbox, because it requires the area to be configured in a very specific way to work. So that's why we have these multiple levels on that. It's an unfortunate side effect of a game engine that relies on inheritance. And that's one of the things too that I think Unity does do a little bit better, is that Unity doesn't have as much inheritance built into it as Godot does. If you want to extend the functionality of a hitbox in Godot, or it really has to do with the way the structure works. So hitbox is like a custom type of area, which means that I either have to extend the area node, which means that I'll be exposing functionality I don't want to, or I have to make it take an area node as a child, which means that the area node could also be configured in a way where I don't want it to. It's the problem you run into with inheritance, and it's why in game development people will preach like crazy composition is better, because if you can just add small chunks of functionality to things, you don't run into this problem where you're having to inherit functionality you don't want or expose functionality you don't want, because you can just pick and choose the little bits that you need and not bring all the rest of the baggage along with it and potentially have to deal with it. Okay, so let's see, this capsule, we're actually going to, I'm not going to create a separate capsule for that. Well, you know what, actually I will. I was going to say you can just copy the capsule resource from the player, but it's usually best practice that your hitbox is smaller than your collision box. So we're going to do that here as well. So we'll do the same thing. We'll move this up 0.5. So right now they're the same size, and I'm going to bring it down a little bit. We're going to take the radius down to like 0.2, so that our hitbox is smaller than our collision area. And that just helps a lot. There's this whole thing in game design where players will perceive fair challenge as being cheating and unfair because they're not aware of their own limitations in their skill. So you need to bias a game in the player's favor, which usually means make the player hitbox smaller than the player actually is, make enemy hitboxes bigger than the enemy, and make the enemies dumber than they realistically should be. And if you do those things, then the player will think it's fun. If you make the enemies actually genuinely intelligent, and where they use legitimate strategy, then people have found that players will perceive that as cheating, even if the enemy AI legitimately isn't cheating, purely because players will just see it as cheating if they're doing poorly. They think they're more clever than they are sometimes. Okay, I forgot. I need to add a thing in here for that. But yeah, I think it was Bungie did a study about that. That I think it was, I don't know if it was Halo 1 or Halo 2. I don't believe it was Halo 3, but it was either 1 or 2, I believe, where they had done a study where they made enemy AI more intelligent, where it would reason about the player, and I think it was trying to do like a pincer maneuver or something around them. And players perceived that as cheating, that the enemy knew where they was, but the enemy was using like cues that any other player would be able to see to know where they were and to get them. But players thought that it was unfair, even though it was legitimate strategy. It's just kind of funny how that works out. So we're also going to add a health component in here, and we will, I like to keep all of these components that don't have a position up at the top. So now we're just going to assign the parent to this health component. So now we should be able to take damage. I'll worry about configuring what I can take damage from later. But for the moment, that'll work. I don't really know what I'm going to set max health to. We'll probably just leave that unset for now. And I don't think I'm going to bother with integer health either. We'll just leave that be. But that should be fine. Okay. So we'll also make that unique. We'll grab a reference to it because we're probably going to need it in here for some stuff. And then the other thing we're going to need on player is to set what we can be, or what we can hit and what we can be hit by from the physics perspective. So let's see, collision layer, we're going to set to, this is a mildly annoying thing with Godot, is that when you set collision layer and collision mask programmatically, unfortunately they don't allow you to use the names of the layers. You have to use the actual binary flags. But a tip is that if you want to know what the binary value to set is, just hover over, click on any collision object that uses collision layers in the editor so that it pops up in the inspector, and then just hover over. So here we can see that layer 2 is player and it's bit 1 value 2. The value is the important part. So I want to set collision layer to 2. If for some reason you wanted to set it to layers 2 and 3, then you would just add the numbers together. Now, mildly annoying that you can't use the name of the layer, then it's only something. I think there is technically a way you can read it from the project settings, but it's really tedious. Maybe that's a good idea for something I should add to ProtoJam, actually. And then the collision mask, let's see, we want to collide with 1, and there's only going to be 1 player, so I'm not going to worry about 2. And for now, I'm going to say that you can collide with units. I might change that because I can foresee them getting in the way and that being annoying. But so 1 and 2 would be 4. So what I like to do is I do this, and then I'll just annotate out here with a comment, player, and then blocking plus units. That way I can remind myself what I intended to set this to, in case for some reason I come back later and change it. All right, so that should be good to go on that front. So now I can come into here and I can create an instance of the player. And I don't need to worry about lifting them up or anything because the collider is set to be where their feet are. All right, there we go. So now we're actually in the level. Also occurs to me I should probably delete the settings file because I overwrote the camera FOV. We'll worry about adding the settings menu in later. Okay, so now I need my player input object. So for that, I am going to go back this time and steal code from one of my other games. Probably not Skyjacker in this case because that's space combat and that doesn't really make sense. So we will go to, probably Cherry Picker. This is a really weird game I did for a jam earlier this year. About the only thing it's probably going to be good for is stealing its player input code. If it has it. I assume it does. It might not, actually. Yes, I do see a player input object in there. Where is it? Ah, here it is. Oh, that is complicated. Yeah, okay. This is why we're going to copy that one. All right, so we'll come back down here to player, and we will do a new script called player input. Okay, and now we're going to see what I can rip out of this one. So let's see, we have, yeah, okay, so this predates when I was using the resource system for settings. So in here we have mouse X sensitivity, min, max, whatever. We don't need any of that anymore because I can just do export, and we will do mouse, or yeah, I guess we're probably going to need separate sensitivity for mouse and controller. So we'll call this mouse X sensitivity, and we don't need to worry about min or max because those come from, well, actually no, I think this is fine. I was gonna say the sensitivity values I think are actually not, they're not like a 0 to 1 thing. They're dealing with like rotation rates, but we can just use the settings for that anyways. So okay, what I'm going to use is a range setting. So the same thing we're using for FOV. we'll set that to null. And I forgot the var keyword. That's why it's not working. So now we'll do the same thing with y. So now I can ditch these values. I'll probably need to go look those up. They're kind of magic numbers to make the camera feel good. I don't know what item. Oh yeah, item rotation is because in cherry picker you can hold items. So we're gonna ditch all of that. Placing item. We'll probably ditch jumping as well for now. Look amount, movement amount. Okay, we'll ditch item rotation. We don't need that. Clear is jumping, placing item, refunding. Yeah, we don't need any of that. Rotate item, jump, place item, refund. Yeah, all this stuff is not needed. Yeah, we don't need the unhandled input right now either. I don't want to leave any code hanging around that's not necessary. So we can ditch that. It's being a repeat again of all the stuff that I don't need. Okay, we'll get rid of that. Okay, this should be better. All right. Let's see. One other thing I want to do on player is I'm going to add a mouse mode controller. So this is one of the custom ProtoJam things. Controlling mouse mode, which is like, is the mouse captured? Is it visible? Is it not captured? Doing that in Godot on its own is actually pretty problematic because it's just a global thing in Godot, what mouse mode is currently in use. And there's a couple problems with that. One is that the user can do things which the operating system will force the mouse mode to change. So if you're in a web export and the player presses escape, it will always release the mouse, no matter what. That's not something that Godot is doing. It's not something that's part of the game. It is the browser releasing the mouse. So you have to have some way of knowing the mouse got released, I need to grab it back. And the problem in Godot is that as far as I've found, and I've looked, I could not find any way to detect when the mouse mode changes. I don't think that Godot knows. I don't know if that's a limitation in the OS. Maybe there is no way of knowing that, or maybe it's a limitation of Godot and they just don't have a way to do it, or maybe I missed something. But either way, I can't find a way to do it. Other people can't find it either from what I found. So you have to deal with the fact that the user might release the mouse and you have to figure out, how do I grab the mouse back? If you've looked at some game jam games, some people will have like a button and they'll say in the description of the game, hey, if the mouse gets uncaptured, press Q or whatever to reacquire it. That's fine. But I personally think that's not a very good user experience, because basically no game ever makes you do that. No AAA game you buy has a thing in it that says, by the way, if the mouse suddenly gets unattached from the game, press this button to grab it again. And that's not shade on the people that do that. That's you're in a game jam environment. You have a limited amount of time, and like I said, it's more of Godot just doesn't have an elegant way of handling this. So you do what you must in the time that you're given. The other problem is that in your games, you're going to need to capture and release the mouse for menus. So if you're doing with a first-person game, you need the mouse to be captured when you're in first-person mode so that you can capture the movement without the mouse moving off the window and not getting captured anymore. Or it hitting the side of the window and not being able to move, which means that now you can't turn your player. But then when you say open the pause menu, you need to uncapture the mouse so that people can see what they're actually clicking on. Because normally when you capture it in most engines, it will lock the mouse to the center of the window. So if you keep it captured, you're not going to be able to navigate the menu with anything other than the keyboard or a controller. So the way I've chosen to get around that, because it can get really complicated trying to detect, like, say, am I in a menu? Okay, well then keep trying to make the mouse visible. Am I in the game? Okay, well then I need to keep trying to capture the mouse. I have a special node in ProtoJam called a mouse mode controller. And the way it works is, as long as it is active, it will constantly try to set the mouse mode to whatever mouse mode you configure it to use. So this one is configured to captured. And as long as this node does not get paused, it will keep trying to recapture it. So if the player clicks away from the game in the browser, As soon as they click back in the game, which allows the game to become active again, because this is constantly trying to reacquire the mouse, it will immediately recapture it. So you don't need a button to recapture the mouse. As soon as the player re-engages with the game, it will assert that mode again. So that solves the first problem. You don't have to worry about the mouse somehow changing into a mode you didn't want, because it'll just keep trying to set it back to what it should be. It's admittedly kind of a brute force approach, but it works. And that's what I've done for all of my jam games as well. The second thing is, what if you have a menu and you want to pop it up? Now, let's say, for example, you're doing something and like a multiplayer game, and you don't want your pause menu, or your settings menu is not a pause menu. The game does not pause while you're in that menu. Well, if you have a mouse mode controller and it's constantly trying to capture the mouse, how do you deal with that? Do you deactivate it? What? Because if the node isn't paused, it's going to keep trying. The way this system works is that the mouse mode controller also has a priority. A higher priority controller will supersede any other one. So in your start menu, or settings menu, whatever thing that needs the mouse to change modes, you put a mouse mode controller on it and you give it a higher priority. So the way I do it is my player, which captures the mouse, has the lowest priority, a priority of 1. And then in my settings menu, I'll usually put in like a priority of 10, because you always want to make sure that that's going to work. And then if you have, say, mini games, for example, maybe like a mini game that pops up that needs the mouse, I'll give it like a priority of like 2 or something like that. Or the main menu will have a priority of like 2. And that will mean that as long as that mouse or as that mode controller is active, it will take priority over all the other ones. And basically the ProtoJam in the background will collect all of the requests in a given frame. Like this priority 1 once it captured, this priority 2 once it visible, this priority 3 once it bound to the window. It will capture all of those in a given frame, and it'll say, okay, priority 3 takes precedence, capture it to the window. And then if you pause the scene that had the priority 3 node in it, it won't submit a request that frame. So now the next frame, you'll get priority 1 once it captured, priority 2 once it visible. The priority 3 won't run because it's paused, so it'll default to priority 2. Same thing, if you pause the scene that has the priority 2 node in it, now it won't run. So you can basically just drag, all that's to say, you can just drag this node into whatever scene needs the mouse to be in a certain mode, give it an appropriate priority, tell it what mode you want, and it'll just figure it out. If it can get that mode, it will get it. There's also some warnings where you'll get some warnings logged to you if you forget to set the priority and multiple things try to assert the mouse mode with the same priority in a given frame. It'll warn you about that it's indeterminate which one should take priority. So the player needs it to be captured, so we put a priority 1 node there. I actually previously had this under game. I had some logic to add a mouse mode controller dynamically. We're not going to worry about that anymore. So we'll just delete that code. There we go. Now our game class is getting nice and short, and we get a ton of errors because I left player in a half implemented state. Yeah, okay. So let's come back to player input now that we've talked about that. So we have these range settings for mouse. We have movement amount, look amount, and mouse movement. All right, so what we're doing, it's been a bit since I've looked at this code. So in process, we're updating our movement amount and our look amount. I'm actually going to change that to physics process. And the reason why is physics interpolation can be a problem. Godot has a system where the physics engine can run at a different tick rate than the frame rate. And in fact, I think most games have that, because you usually don't want to be running your physics at like 120 frames a second. That may not even be feasible. So if you're on a high refresh rate monitor, that's just not even possible a lot of the times. So your physics is set to some fixed tick rate that may not match your frame rate. That means that your visuals are not going to be in sync with the physics, because the physics are likely running at a lower tick rate than the visuals are. So if you just update the visuals to only match the position set by the physics process, then your visuals are going to be very stuttery. You're going to see things just sort of snapping around. Because if your tick rate, and in fact something I should do here is change the physics tick rate. I think it's under common. There it is. We're going to change this to 10. We'll talk about why in a second. If your tick rate is low enough, you'll see that stutter, which can be a problem. So one of the things that Godot will recommend is using physics interpolation. And what will happen is Godot will look at the velocity of the physics object, and it will try to predict where it would be if the physics tick was happening faster. So it'll see, okay, at this 1/10 of a second, it's moving up at 3 meters a second. So, and the regular process function, the one that's for rendering, that's running at the frame rate, it's say running at 120 frames per second instead of 10. So it will try to say, okay, we are this fraction of a way between two physics ticks. Let's try and estimate where this physics object would be, and it will allow you to render it at that estimated or interpolated position, physics interpolation. For the most part, Godot does that automatically for you. It's just a thing you enable. And in fact, I do need to go do that. So also FYI, physics interpolation is not on by default. You have to turn it on. And that's important for the camera. When you have a 3D camera and it's attached to a physics object, you can get some really weird ghosting and stuttering effects unless you have physics interpolation on. But there's a problem in that physics interpolation kind of gets a little wonky with cameras. So you need it to make everything not ghost, but on the camera node specifically, you need to turn it off, and then you need to do the interpolation yourself manually, because the general purpose interpolation that Godot applies to all nodes doesn't work properly with cameras. And there's an article in Godot's documentation about this. It's one of the things that unless you know about it, you don't know that you need to do something for it. But the recommendation is from them, turn your physics tick rate down during development to like 10, because that will make the issue very obvious, and it will remind you that you need to go fix it later. Because when the tick rate is high and it's closer to the frame rate, the ghosting issue becomes less of a problem. It's less noticeable. So they'll specifically advise a very low tick rate during development. And then that reminds you to go back and fix it. And even they advise to not fix it right away. The documentation is like, this is usually a polished step because it's just visual artifacting. So we've got that set now. Physics interpolation is on. Tick rate is down to 10. So we will start seeing some ghosting potentially. But we'll worry about that when we get to it. And this generally is going to apply to other engines as well. How they handle interpolation is probably going to be different, but okay. So first thing here, I need to map these inputs. So we have strafe left, strafe right, move forward, move backward. So we'll go into the project settings, and we're just going to add those. So we'll do strafe right, and then we'll also, okay, I need to copy these. Mildly annoying. You can't, even though this is a pop-up, you can't copy anything from the text field while it's open. Okay, and then we'll add move backward. And then we're just going to quickly map these. So strafe left, strafe right, move forward, and move backward. And then we're also going to map these on the controller. So I've got a PS5 controller plugged in. We'll just, oops, that is the wrong direction. Strafe right, and then move forward, and move backward. All right, there we go. So now those are mapped, so this should be fine. A lot of Godot examples will tell you to use, or a lot of people, what they'll do is do input dot get input, or where is that field? Get joy, what is that? Get, well, they'll use a singular get, or get axis, I think is what people will do. So you'll see some stuff that says get axis, and they'll just put like left, right, whatever, and then they'll grab the individual components and they'll build them into a vector, and they'll normalize the vector so you don't get that whole players can walk faster to 45-degree angle thing. You don't need to do all that though. Godot has a get vector. The only reason I bring it up is because I have seen tons of code in tutorials where people don't use this, but the input.getVector function will automatically take into account normalizing the vector for you, and it also takes into account joystick dead zones, which the get axes and stuff, I could be mistaken, but I don't think get axis does take it into account. Yeah, it doesn't say it does. So, especially if you're going to be using controller support, you should probably be using get vector, unless you specifically do want the input to not be normalized. There are some cases where maybe in a flight sim you might not want that, but just an FYI that is there, so you don't need to manually assign your vector. Now, okay, so for settings, yeah, so you can see this is my old. I used to use enums for my settings, so we're actually going to get rid of that, and we are actually just going to grab the sensitivities directly from these range values. So mouse X sensitivity. Actually, I'm going to add setting to the end of that just to remind myself. So all I need to do is do get value. And then I can do the same thing with Y. All right, so now we've got the sensitivity. We're grabbing the mouse movement. Now it looks like this controller does not support, or this input script did not support controller input. So I will have to add that back in. But we will worry about that when we get to it. I think there's also a bug in this, I believe, because we're resetting the mouse movement on the physics process, which I believe was intended. I believe the reason I was doing that in Cherry Picker was because when you pause the game, it would accumulate mouse movement from the menu. So I was resetting it, but I recall in one of the other game jams I did, I found that was causing another problem. So I'll probably have to look that up off stream and dig through my code and figure out what about that was problematic. And then this is we're not going to worry about that. I don't need to worry about this input if is captured, whatever. Well, actually, for one, this should be unhandled input. And we need to say if the mouse mode is captured, we'll get the screen relative coordinates. That way we're not accumulating input. Actually, I think, does unhandled run when we're paused? Let me double check that. I don't see anything. Process mode. It is only called if process method is overridden. I think it does run even when it's paused. It looks like it. Okay, yeah, so we do need this. I was going to say, we could still run into a problem with us getting the relative screen position while we're paused otherwise. So we'll just specifically check. And then what I really should be doing is calling get. You know what? I was going to say, if you're using unhandled input in Godot and you do something with the input, you probably should make a call to set input as handled so that nothing else will receive it in its unhandled input handler. But mouse movement is kind of a weird case where it doesn't really matter. I can't think of a reason why that would affect something. So at least for now, we're not going to mark it as handled, which means that other nodes can also get the same mouse input event. Okay. So then we need some settings to invert the axes. That's an accessibility thing. I was ignorant about this. I used to wonder, because some games would have it. Some games would have a setting that lets you invert the y-axis, which I get. That's, you know, some people prefer having up be down and down be up in first-person shooters. I think that's a holdover from like N64 days and early first-person shooters where they did have it inverted. They used like flight controls, which is like Halo 1 on PC. I remember it had that, and it always confused me. But I always wondered why some games would also allow you to invert the left and right as well. And the reason for that, I've learned, is it's an accessibility feature. Some people can't hold a standard controller the way that it's intended to be held with it, you know, the sticks together at your thumbs. Sometimes the controller needs to be on some kind of special mount that will hold the controller for the person if they don't have the grip strength or for whatever reason can't hold it, which might mean that the controller is being held in some cases upside down. And in those cases, you need to invert the left and right stick for it to be normal for the person using it. Ideally, you should also allow them to reassign the axes, although I've seen very few games that do that in practice, because it's also possible that the controller may be held with one stick above the other, in which case up and down now becomes left and right. Again, I've seen very few games that have a toggle to do that. It's not crazy difficult to do, but just an FYI, if you're making a first-person shooter especially, or really any kind of game, you probably should add a way to invert the left and right movement and the up and down movement, because consider that some people may need to use the controller in a weird orientation. And there is some software that can, like, you can use to override that behavior, like Steam Input can override it for Steam games you're playing, but it's a nice to have. And realistically, I mean, you can see here what I'm about to do. It does not take very much to implement this. It's just a Boolean flag. So if you can do it, it's a good thing to do. So we'll say mouse invert X setting, and we'll do a Boolean setting for this, not Boolean save data, Boolean setting, and then we'll do the same thing with Y. And I like to keep separate inverts for mouse and controller. In general, I also like to keep separate sensitivity for mouse and controller, because even for games I play, I sometimes go back and forth between them. So let's say for yaw, which is our left and right, or X, we're going to say if, I already have the word if, get value. So in this case, it's a Boolean setting, so that's going to return true or false. If we're inverting the X, then we're just going to set the yaw equal to the negative, and then we'll do the same thing on Y. And get value here. There we go. All right, so that is our player input for at least mouse and keyboard. More or less done, honestly. So now all I need to do is drop an instance of that. And this is just a script, not a scene, so we can just drop that in. And I like to do these as nodes because it allows you to connect them to multiple things. So if you have, say, a weapon, then you can just directly connect the weapon to the player input node. You don't need to go through a script to do it. But we are also going to make it unique because the main player script does need to reference it. And we do need to assign these settings. Otherwise, we're going to get some null dereference things. Realistically, in my ready function, I should be checking to make sure that they're not null. But we're just going to do this for now. So we'll do create resource. We're going to do a range setting, and we're going to do mouse X sensitivity setting. And then we're going to do the same thing for the Y, another range setting. And now on these, we need to give them unique names. So let's see, we'll do mouse X sensitivity. I would not be surprised if I misspell that word at least once on this stream. Okay, so now I need to set their ranges. So we're going to look at the code that I had written for this before and find all the good magic numbers here. So it looks like I had the min on the X is 0.05 and the max is 0.2. So we will just plug those in. And our step value is 0.01. That's probably fine. And we'll set the default value right in the middle at like 0.1. I find this is always a tricky thing, is trying to find the right default sensitivity for mouse and controller. I find that personally, I tend to play games with my sensitivity slider about 3/4 of the way full. So not usually at the default, but a little bit higher. But I've done enough game jams that I've found that if I balance the game to where it's comfortable for me with the sensitivity at 50% in the middle, then usually most people don't have a problem with it. And as long as you make the setting available, it's kind of a moot point, but you do kind of want to make the default be as close to what most people will want. So that would be my advice, is for just about anything, try to balance your, same thing with your audio levels. Make sure, go play another game, a popular game. Subnautica 2 just released, go play that, I don't know. Play a game and get the volume and your mouse at a level you like. And then look at where that setting slider is in that game. Is your volume, and try to adjust like your speakers, your headphones, whatever. Try to adjust it to where it's a comfortable volume to when the slider is at 50%. And then do the same with your own game. Close that game, don't touch the volume on your speakers or your headset, go into your game, and then tweak it so that your slider at 50% is at a comfortable volume for you. That, I found, is the best strategy to get the volume to be at a reasonable level, is just pick a popular game and basically just reverse engineer whatever its volume is, and put that at your 50%. I'm sure that somewhere someone who's an audio engineer could say that there is this ideal decibel value that you want. That's the quick and dirty way of doing it, I found. So I will literally, when I'm doing a game jam, open one of my previous games, adjust my speakers until it sounds right, and then pop back into the new game and adjust the setting range until it matches. Okay, so enough about that. Same thing with the mouse. So X sensitivity should be good. Y sensitivity is 0.05 and the max is 0.33. That's gonna make it hard to remember what the default is. What would that be? What is that range? Get out the calculator again. 0.33 minus 0.05 divided by 2 plus 0.05. Okay, 0.2 is the initial value. I probably should have guessed that. Okay, so then step value of 0.01, that should be fine. There we go. And then these are just going to get exposed as sliders, so it should be fine. One thing you might want to think about, though, whenever you're doing settings, and maybe I might change this, but think about what's actually going to get saved to your game settings file. Because let's say in my case, I release a game on Steam and I have the minimum FOV as 60, right? And I code my settings slider, or we'll say my minimum FOV when I release has the minimum FOV is 60 and the max it may be 120. And the default is 90. Let's say that I code my settings slider to where it goes from 0 to 1. At 0, it's 60, and at max, it's 120. And then all I store in the settings file is the float of, 0.5, 0.1, 1, whatever. If you then later update your game and you change what the minimum and maximum are, then you're going to screw over all your players who had already set their settings to a value they liked. So because now, if I update my game to where the minimum FOV is 40 and the max is 180, and somebody had their setting set at 0 or 1 or anywhere in between, that FOV that they're now going to get is different because the setting file only stored the percent, the ratio, the 0.11 between min and max. So think about that when you're doing your settings. Where possible, I would personally advise storing the actual value of the setting. One, because if the player ever needs to tweak their settings for some reason, players will inevitably write guides on how to modify your game save files and whatever else. It's frankly going to make it everyone's lives easier if the setting is the literal value. But two, it protects you from having to worry about what happens if you change the min and max value if you store the literal value. Now, the flip side of that is what happens if you make the minimum value higher. Okay, so let's say that you release the game and your min value is 40, and then you change it to where the min value is now 60. You're going to have to put some logic in the game to either allow values outside that range if you load them from the settings file, or if that's going to break something, like suddenly the player is going to see behind them, or something's going to start clipping into the camera, or, you know, whatever else that setting may have been controlling, then you need to have logic to adjust it to the new minimum. But I would say that you want to avoid messing with the settings if you can. So it's generally better to store the literal value unless there's some very specific reason why that's going to cause problems. So just think about that, future proofing, and think about updates. What's going to happen when you update the game? Same thing with save data. Save data can be really tricky, especially to the point where I would recommend if you're storing save data, you should probably store a version number with it. Maybe not necessarily the version of the game, but the version of whatever is parsing it. That way that if somebody loads an old save file, you can detect, oh, this was a V1 file. The X value was, you know, divided by 10 or something, or I snapped the X value to whatever. And, you know, you can do whatever you need to do to adjust how you read it. That way, if you store that version number, you can detect that you need to change how you're parsing it, so that you can avoid, you know, forcing players to lose their old save data or accidentally parsing it in a way that's going to break something. All these fun little, you know, if there weren't a million other details you have to worry about in game design, a few more for thought. Okay, so player input is good. So on player, I need to grab the player input object. And I'm probably going to change this to be a state machine later. Because if I want the player to jump, I'm probably going to need a state machine. Oh, yeah, what's up? Available and are easy for modders. That's an interesting one. What do you mean, like, I'm not sure I understand the available part. I assume by easy you mean like easy to add content for it. Are you asking about stuff like Steam Workshop, or are you just talking like in general about modding games? Because I don't have a ton of experience with Workshop. I can talk a little bit about how Godot handles content, which would generally be how you handle it with Steam Workshop. And I can talk a little bit about like the reverse engineering aspect, about like how, like what makes it easy to reverse engineer a game. I guess I'm just curious, like what, before I go off on a tangent, a little more, if you can be a little more specific. If not, I can just talk about whatever. But let's see. Oh, okay. So let me, honestly, I think I'm losing my train of thought on this example game anyway, so let's just go ahead and we'll change gears here for a minute. Let me go ahead and I was actually, I will say too, I was actually thinking about streaming some modding stuff, maybe even this week, I don't know yet, because I need to do some work on my modding tool for Riverworld. I've brought it up, take a shot every time I mention that this stream. So okay, if we come over here to Rivermod as an example, Riverworld is a very old, like, Windows 95 game. It's one of the things that makes it easy to mod. Well, where do I want to start with this? There's two approaches to modding. If a game doesn't have built-in modding support, games with built-in modding support, you know, they support things like Steam Workshop. Generally, the way that's going to work is that the game will have some mechanism to load a content pack. So in Godot's case, let me open the file explorer here. So when you save a scene in, say, Godot, or whatever file Unity creates, it's been a while. Godot, for instance, makes these TSCN files. But whenever you export the project, it compresses them into something called a PCK, or a pack file. Your game, whenever you release it, so let me find one of these games. We'll go to Maximum Voltage here. This is an old Game Jam game. Or, well, that's maybe not a good example. Let me find one that has a PCK file. Dang, where is one? Oh, there we go. We'll do the last Game Jam I was in. Okay, so we go to the Windows export. And the reason you got to do that is The web export doesn't have a PCK, I don't believe. So Godot and a few other engines, CryEngine kind of does something similar. You generally have the main exe, which is usually just the engine itself, and then you have a content pack, which is all of the scripts, all of the textures, whatever else. Most game engines, that's how they'll work, is they'll compress all that into a data file. Now this exe is going to be coded when it's exported by your game engine to load this pack file, which is going to contain most of the game's contents. It varies by engine, but that's generally how they work. There's usually some kind of data file, and then the core engine is instructed to load that data file, unpack it, and get all the scripts and everything else from it. Games that support modding will usually have an ability to dynamically load more pack files at runtime. And it's not even just modding. A lot of times that's how DLC will work as well, is they don't actually change the main executable of the game. It's just when you download the DLC, an additional content pack gets chucked in there, and the game will have some logic in it that will scan its directory and say, what are the PCK files or whatever files? We'll keep using Godot as an example. Is there another PCK file here? If so, load it. And that's generally how it'll work. Now, sometimes for security reasons, they might only load files from specific known paths, but generally that's how it'll work. So in Godot, for example, you can literally just go into Godot. I'm going to open some of ProtoJam's code here and show you the background loader, because this actually could theoretically do this. So the background loader, if we go up here at the top, it has this load async function, and it takes a resource path. That can just be any path on the file system. Godot internally, if I actually go, let me see if I can find where the loader actually runs. Start loading resource. Yeah, here we go. Load threaded request. So in Godot, you can literally just load a resource file, which could be a scene, audio, textures, whatever, from just any old file path. That could be a file path that's inside the PCK file itself, because this is basically, in fact, I think it literally is a zip, or at least it's something equivalent to a zip. Or it could be a file path that's on the user's file system. So most game engines have that ability to load content at runtime that wasn't shipped with it. So when you're doing something with, say, Steam Workshop, Steam will, for you, one of the things it'll do for you is put that content somewhere in your game directory. Or you can query Steam. Steam is like a DLL, a dynamic link library that your game can access. It's like its interface to Steam. And you can ask Steam from the game side and say, hey, has the user subscribed to any workshop content? If so, get me the data for that. And then the game can just load it using whatever means necessary. So that would be like the official path for modding, is that the game just has a built-in mechanism to dynamically load something at runtime. That's the happy path. You know, that's all your Left 4 Dead mods, things like that. That's generally how they work. When you get into stuff that doesn't have a happy path, there's two approaches you can take. One approach is you can disassemble the game itself. So you can literally point a disassembly tool like Ghidra, or there's some specific tools built for various game engines. Unity, for example, has a disassembly tool specifically built for it. And that tool you'll point it at the executable in the data file for the game, and it will extract the code, extract the assets, and rip it out of that packed format, allow you to edit it, and then shove it back into the packed format. So Godot's PCK files, for example, there is a tool, I think I have it downloaded, but I don't know where I stored it. There's a PCK viewer, for example, that you can use to view the contents of these files. And I believe you can also change them. And if not change them, anyone can download Godot and generate a new PCK. So that would be like one way. If you're playing a Godot game that doesn't have built-in modding support, is you can just edit this file, because this is where all the data lives. Now, some games will encrypt that, but the decryption key has to be somewhere in the executable for it to be able to read it. So generally, there'll be other tools that help you find the decryption key, so then you can decrypt the PCK file, edit its contents, and now when the game loads it, it's none the wiser that something's changed. Now, that would be the case for like 90% of modern games, is they have some kind of packed data format. Usually someone will have done the work to figure out how this packed data format works, generally by disassembling the game. They'll trace through it with something like Godot, which is a disassembly tool. And they'll figure out how it reads that file, make a tool that emulates that behavior, and then other people can use the tool to edit the contents. When you get into older games, there is another pattern that you can take. With newer games, it's not as feasible, but with older games, you can also just look at the raw binary data of a file and just sometimes figure out what it contains, which sounds crazy difficult, but it's actually not that bad because there aren't that many ways to store binary data. And if you kind of already know what kind of data is supposed to be in the file, you can just sort of look at it in a hex viewer and start to figure out, oh, I know this file must contain vertex data for a 3D model because it's literally named, you know, character dot whatever. So you're like, I know that this must contain vertex data. It probably contains normal data for the model. It probably contains sub objects for like rigging and skeletons. It probably contains UV coordinates for mapping textures to that. And it probably contains face data. So you can look at that and say, all of that data is probably somewhere in this file, and vertices are usually shared by faces. So I just need to look for something that looks like maybe three, you know, like a big list of 3 coordinates. That's probably my vertex data. Then if I find something else that's like lists of 3 to 4 relatively low integers, like you'll find a list that is suspiciously like 189, 892 or something like that. You'll find that list. You're probably like, oh, those are face data. Those are indices into the vertex array that was somewhere else in the file. So you can start to kind of piece it together. It admittedly does require a bit of experience and some knowledge about how whatever kind of data you're looking for works. And it can get especially complicated if you're dealing with stuff like audio or video files, because those could be in all kinds of weird compression going on. But you can start to piece together how it works by going that approach. I'll say, yeah, I see the face. That's the approach I used with Rivermod. And as crazy it is I actually kind of like doing that. It's like solving a crossword puzzle. It's just very rewarding when you finally figure it out. But to be honest, with older games, they usually don't use that much crazy compression. There's not that much weird stuff going on. They're very rarely encrypted, or if they are, the encryption is not very complicated. So it's not difficult for old games to figure out how their binary file formats work. The go-to, though, if you don't want to go down that path, is you disassemble the game itself. You disassemble the executable, and then you step through it. You say, oh, I can see that at this point it's calling the Windows function to load a file. I'm going to start looking at all the assembly instructions that follow that, or if you're using Godot, it might be able to convert the assembly into an approximate C++ disassembly. You start looking at it and go, oh, okay, it's reading that, you know, 1 byte of data, then it's storing it into a variable and it's comparing something, and you can just start to figure out from the code what it's doing with that data and figure out what the data means from that way. With Riverworld, I tried to disassemble it. It didn't work. There's any number of reasons why that could be the case, but so I can show you here. There's various tools to help you, but if we go to Rivermod and I go to the wiki part of it and I go to the modding resources where I've got all of these, my documentation on it. Let's see, what would be a good one to look at? Okay, the XY file. Okay, so in Riverworld, it predates when games started using packed data for their files. So Riverworld's install directory just has a bunch of files with all kinds of weird extensions like www and xxx and xy. So the xy file, let's think about that. Riverworld is a grid-based game. There's like a big 512 by 512 map, and you can place buildings on a grid. And there is a file named level1.xy. So right there, But there's another file called like level1.map or map1 or something, I forget. And I had already figured out that that map file contained the actual like terrain of the level and like which textures were supposed to be rendered. So I knew that this XY file, it says it's level 1 something, but I know it's not the terrain. So my guess is it contains the positions because it's called XY. It must contain the position of something in it. So I opened it up and I used a tool called imhex, which is like a reverse engineering disassembly tool. It's like a hex viewer, but it lets you kind of dynamically create a language to parse the file. So I figured out kind of incrementally looking at the file and adding on to this parsing script what was in there. And that's the other way you do it. I wish that I'll say this, if you're really curious about more modding, I'm probably doing a very bad explanation of it. I'm not used to presenting on modding specifically. There is a channel, I think it's Nathan Briggs, maybe Nathan Braggs, I forget his last name. He does a lot of great videos on the disassembly approach specifically. So he's done like, I think Age of Empires and a few other games. A big thing on his channel is that he will find old games that are not playable because maybe the DRM is busted or something broke in a later version of Windows and it doesn't work. And he will kind of go through and explain what he's doing. Honestly, some of it at times can be over my head because the disassembly approach can be a little complicated at times. But that's another good resource if you just want to learn a little bit about that. A big part of it, though, really is just kind of experience. I hate to say it. It's just, or I'll say this, put yourself in the mind of the programmer a lot of the times too, especially if you're trying to reverse engineer the file rather than trying to disassemble the game. Put yourself in the mind of the programmer. Like, okay, I need to store the positions of the characters. How am I going to read that back from the file? Because like a big thing, I mentioned that a lot of these follow the same pattern. Well, how do you know how to read the file? How many, I have to read, how many bytes do I read from this file, So a lot of files will put something at the beginning that's like a length variable that says how long the file is going to be or how many entries are in an array. So a very common thing you'll see, and let me see if it's in here. Let's see, we have chunk, character chunk, blah, blah, blah. Individual chunk. Yeah, okay. So I'm not going to get into the specifics of this, but we'll just say there is a section of this XY file that contains the positions of characters on the map. All right. The very first thing it contains is a 32-bit number, which is how many characters are going to be in that section. Because if the map only has one character, you don't want to store, 6,000 positions that are just blank. So the very first thing, like physically in the file, is the number of entries. And that's going to tell the code when it's reading, okay, how many things do I need to read? Oh, 6. And then it'll go into like a for loop, reading 6 entries. So in this case, immediately following it is an array of those entries. So in this case, I chose to name this entity. And I figured out that this array, every element in this array is a 32-bit number that has an ID of the character, a 32-bit number that I don't know what it does, frankly. I put in here that I don't know, but there's some other number that does something. And then there's a 32-bit number for its X position and a 32-bit number for its Y position. I think actually, this might be easier to show. Where is imhex in my list here? Am I blind? There it is. There we go. We'll actually show, this will do like a graphic overlay and make it easier to see what the heck is going on. So let me see. I need to find this real quick. 1 second. Need to find the file. Open recent, open other, open file. Let's see, where the heck do I have this? It is in, okay, Riverworld, Cryo Interactive, Let's see, where is it? Level 1. There we go. Okay. So now back to this. Okay, so here we go. So this is the contents of an XY file from Riverworld. So I can kind of walk you through, actually. So I don't have the pattern loaded at the moment. So this would be how I start, right? So right off the bat, you can just literally look at the file and you can see there's something weird, right? You can see these columns of data where there's a bunch of zeros in it. And I mean, right off the bat, you can also see there seems to be words in here. So VH almost certainly means a vehicle. Resb probably means resource because it's an RTS game. Batty is a little bit weird. The game was developed by French developers. So some of these are abbreviations for French words, but you can kind of see like indie probably means individual or character. So you can already start to see that there's something in here. There's probably sections in this file. You can figure that out right away. Terror probably means terrain. Vega probably means vegetation. So right off the bat, you can kind of get a rough idea of what's in this file. This is and the reason I wanted to show this one is it's a very friendly file to figure out. Because it does have these 4-letter abbreviations in it. So right off the bat, that tells me that this file uses 4-letter words to signify different sections of the file. Now, you got to think about, though, how is the parser going to read this? It's probably not going to read each byte and then say, oh, this spelled veggie. That means I'm at the end of whatever this section was. Somehow it has to know how long this person section is. It could be just reading ahead and finding where it finds another 4-letter thing, but what happens if the bytes that spell this happen to also be valid data that could be in this section? So that's probably not how it works. It's probably storing some length somewhere, either a length of an array or a number of bytes or something like that. So you start looking at the other data in here. So we see purse, and then there's a 4 after it. So what does that 4 mean? That's probably a length, but there's obviously more than 4 bytes between this and the next section. So that's probably not a byte length. It's probably an array length. So the next thing I would do is I would select all of these bytes and I would start seeing if it's divisible by 4. It's kind of hard to see down here at the bottom, but it says that's 67 bytes. So that's probably not quite right. But then I see these zeros are suspicious, and then there's a 1. So that kind of tells me that this may actually just be a 32-bit number, which might be why that number was off. So if I skip those and just assume that that's a 32-bit integer, and I select from after it, and I go all the way to this veggie section, I look down here, that's exactly 64 bytes. 64 is divisible by 4. That tells me that this is probably an array that contains 4 elements, and each element is 16 bytes. And if I select 16 bytes after this 4-byte section, notice that it ends right at this 2. And then this 2 ends right at this 3, and this 3 ends right at this 4. So that right there tells me that whatever data is in this person section, a person object, presumably, is 16 bytes of data. And that the first thing in front of it is the number of elements that are going to be in here. So, and this 1, 2, 3, 4, that's incrementing. So that tells me that's probably some kind of ID number. If it's incrementing like that, it could be something else, but that, to me at least, that seems like an ID number. So then I can look at this other data and I can say, okay, well, this is probably a 32-bit number because all of them have a bunch of zeros after them. So we can probably ignore those bytes because there's no other data in any of them. And then I can just look at the rest of them. I can see that there's this thing. All of them have a 1 here. So every single one of these then has a 1. So whatever that data is, it's not different. So one of the strategies you can do is you can go into the game, and if this number is ever different for something, you can try and find that object where that number is different and just think about what's different about this object. Now, in my case, I don't know what that means, so I don't know. So I just marked that as unknown. It's always 1. You could try changing it. You go in here and edit it, change it to a 2, run the game and see what happens, see if it breaks. But That's a strategy. But then the next thing I see, we assume that's a 32 byte number. We have this number, and then we have this number. So that's where you start to say, okay, well, this file is called XY. So this is probably an X number, and that's probably a Y number, presumably. It might be, then you just have to figure out, well, what format is this thing saved in? So that's kind of the approach. This is a very easy file, honestly. But if I copy the pattern file here and I tell it to run it, this will highlight the data, and you can actually see the tree of data here. So a lot of binary files will start with what's called a magic. It's usually a 4-byte thing that's usually human readable that just helps the game engine or software detect if this is a valid file. So in this case, it always starts POS and then a null character. So presumably this is a position file is probably what that means. And then if we can say here that we have a chunk of data, this first chunk is a person chunk, or a character chunk, whatever. We have 4 entries. So we can see down here 4 entries. And then here's our array of 4 entries. And I figured out ID. Don't know what that other number is, so I left it unhighlighted, and then X and Y. And in here, the X coordinate, this is where it can get a little complicated because floating point numbers get saved in weird formats in games. So in this case, I found out that the coordinates were being stored as an integer, but then to get the actual floating point number, you need to divide it by 65,000. The only reason I know that is because I tried to read it as an integer and the number was absurdly large. So if you just highlight that, the number would be 32,000 whatever. And what I would do is I would just change these numbers and I would see where the character moved in game. And then eventually I realized that that's what was going on, is that they store the number as an integer and then they just divide it, which is a strategy some older games use to store floating point numbers, is they would just multiply the float by something like 100, or usually by a power of 2, like 256, 128, 65,000. They'll multiply it, and then when they read it back, they divide it to get the floating point back. But yeah, that's one of the strategies for modding these games, is you just reverse engineer the file and figure out what's in it. Sometimes it's easy, like this one, where you can kind of reason about what's in it. There's other strategies where you can, if you have multiple files with the same extension, you can try swapping them, like swapping their file names, and see what it does to the game when you do that. But a big part of it is just reasoning about it. Or you go the other route and you reverse engineer the executable of the game, which is a whole other kind of thing that, like I said, that other YouTuber could probably talk a bit more about how that works, because there's different challenges involved with that. And namely, you usually have to know some assembly, some level of assembly, and usually need to know C, C++ as well. Appreciate that. It's I don't know if it's enthusiasm or insanity, but yeah, that's at least how you do that. And once you know how this file format works, or you know, whatever else, I don't want to save. Are you sure you want to exit? Yes, there. No, don't save. There we go. Once you know how the file format works, you can tell, or you can start making, you know, modding tools. So in Rivermod's case, and funny enough, Rivermod is actually a Godot project. You can use Godot for things other than games. So all I did is I went into Godot, because it's a game engine, and I wrote code that just knew how to load these files. You know, I figured out how to parse the files, so I just wrote scripts in Godot that would parse the files as well. And it's easy to do that in a game engine because you have all the facilities for texturing and meshes and UV mappings. But, yeah. Yeah, good for the modding community is always nice. They'll certainly appreciate that. But yeah, most game engines, I would say, whatever engine you end up using, just look up. So if we go here, well, I won't do it right now, but if you just search your game engine and mod support, you can probably find a document published officially by your game engine that will tell you how they recommend to do modding. So Godot's case, they generally recommend that you use loading resources this way, and there's some stuff you need to do. The big thing I will say about modding, think about security, because if you allow people to load any code in your game, they could potentially do malicious stuff. It might contain malware. So that's why a lot of games, when you go to do mods, if it's a game that has built-in modding support, a lot of times when you go to load the mod, you'll get some kind of pop-up that's like, hey, legal disclaimer, mods could contain some bad code in it. If this thing steals your identity when it runs, because it's got a cookie stealer or a Bitcoin miner in it, don't come sue us. You chose to load this. I don't know the legal jargon you need to use there, but that is something to be concerned about, because if you can load any code, like Godot has functions to delete any file or load any file, and web files, you could make a mod for a Godot game that scrapes the person's computer for their cookies and emails it, or sends it to some random web server, or turns it into a bot farm. So you need to be careful about that kind of stuff when you do mods. The way you generally get around that is you use interfaces. Well, that's the first way. So your game will usually be coded to only load a certain type of resource. So you'll look at the file that the user's trying to load, and you'll say, this is an instance of a player model, which is like a custom thing that you code, like an interface in C# or in GDScript or whatever. And you will just refuse to load it if it's not an instance of that. Because if it's something else entirely, you don't want to load that thing. The other thing, and Godot doesn't have this, unfortunately, I think Unity does, is something called a sandbox. In software, a sandbox is like an isolated environment that doesn't have access to all of the functionality or data of the main software that's loading it. It's really common in plugin frameworks, which is basically what modding is a plugin framework. So in software that supports a sandbox, you can basically disable functionality. So you can say that if I load a script from a mod, that script will not be able to call this function. That is banned. And when the engine sees the script try to call that function, it will throw an error and say, no, I will not do that. I refuse. So your web browser does that. There are certain things that if your JavaScript or whatever tries to do, the web browser, before it executes that line of code, will go, nope, not allowed, not doing it. I'm going to throw an error and crash. Java does this as well. It has a you can in a concept called a class loader in a security context or security manager. You can basically say, no, you are not allowed to call the file system operations. I ban you from doing that. To my knowledge, Godot doesn't have it. I think Unity does. Like I said, look into the documentation for it, but for instance, it's very unlikely that most people are going to want to write a mod that has access to the internet or has access to any file outside of the game's directory. So you want to consider writing interfaces to where they can't call the functions to load those files, because then they might load something they're not supposed to and steal it. You want to provide like your own function that only allows them to access stuff in the game directory, or only allows them to access the things you think they should reasonably be allowed to access. At least for official modding support. Like I said, if somebody wants to go in and edit your executable's assembly code, or do what I was doing and messing with the binary data, they can probably bypass that. But at that point, you're kind of beyond official modding support, and you're into people doing stuff that's a little more sketchy. But yeah, definitely think about that. At minimum, just make sure you're warning your users, because mods are no different than downloading some random executable. If you allow people to include code in the mod, it's no different than downloading some random untrusted executable off the internet. The only difference is that it doesn't get it execute itself, it gets executed by something else. So just make sure you're thinking of that. At minimum, warn your players about it, because a lot of people don't know that. They don't think about it. They think, oh, it's a mod for a game, what harm could it do? And they don't think about the fact that this game engine can do a lot of stuff on their computer that maybe you don't want it doing. I actually, funnily enough, so I actually worked in application security. Well, funny thing that happens is that you on company computers, you sometimes have to scan for code that's vulnerable or applications that are vulnerable. One of the things that would get scanned for, and this isn't just at the company I worked for, it's a general thing, is Minecraft. Believe it or not, because employees will install Minecraft on their work computers, and Minecraft had a vulnerability in it that could allow it to do a lot of malicious stuff. So if you downloaded a mod that was malicious in just the right way, it could make your copy of Minecraft steal data or all kinds of other stuff. So it's a legitimate thing that like companies had to check their computers for unpatched versions of Minecraft, even if they're not a game studio at all, because Minecraft itself could be exploited by malicious mods. I think in that case, it was actually not even just mods. I think it was if you connected to a malicious Minecraft server, it could do it as well. But yeah, games are a very real security concern. Not just from the game itself being malicious, but from bad actors using your game in a malicious way. Yeah, I mean, I've been there. I've been there as well. I'm a lot more skeptical about it nowadays than I used to be. And you want to know the worst part about it too is game mods, because they're usually written in a proprietary language like GD script or whatever else. A lot of malware scanners don't know to detect malware in them, because who's going to write a malware scanner that checks a GD script file isn't malicious? Well, the malware scanners on, say, Windows Defender, it's looking at the executable code. It's looking for like compiled common language framework or common, I think it's either CLI or CLF. I forget what C# compiles into. It's looking for that. It's looking for like Java class files. It's looking for DLLs, libs, executables, things like that. It's not looking at stuff like, a mod for, say, Godot that's in like PCK format. It might not know how to read that. It might try, but it's not going to know what a GD script file is unless somebody goes in and makes a rule in that malware scanner for that. So in a lot of ways, mods for games, especially games that use a proprietary scripting language, can actually be more dangerous than just downloading random executables, because there's a decent chance that your malware scanner is not going to be able to detect that that thing is malicious. Now, it might detect it once the game starts running it. It might catch it, but by that point, you're kind of flipping a coin whether or not it catches it in time to stop it from doing anything bad. But like if you download, an exe with malware in it these days, your browser is going to ask Windows Defender, and Windows Defender is going to go, whoa, what the heck are you trying to do? I am not letting you download that, and I'm not letting you run it. Every once in a while you'll get that, thankfully, that it warns you that it's quarantining that thing because it found a Trojan or something in it. But with game executables, it's less likely. There's actually two. Games can also be vulnerable. So we talked about games. Now, modern games will compress a lot of their assets into an archive file because it's faster to download, and it's better for disk space, and it makes it easier to package and sell your game that way than having 100 different files. Zip files, funnily enough, there is a vulnerability called a zip slip. Security researchers love their funny names for things. Basically, you can make a zip file that contains no data, but it says in its header that it contains, say, 30 gigabytes of data. And what happens is when software tries to unpack that zip file, it will explode into like 30 gigabytes of disk space. There's not a lot of reason that somebody would do that with, say, like a software mod, but you have that with like web applications. If you have a website that lets you upload a zip file and it tries, like itch.io, for example, when you do a web export, you export it typically as a zip. If some, presumably they have protections. I don't know if they do, and this is a warning, don't go testing it. But if they don't have protections against zip slips and somebody makes a zip file that says it's 300 gigabytes and you try to uncompress it, or sorry, I'm confusing two different issues here. That's not a zip slip. That's a different thing. A zip slip is when you zip files, weirdly enough, can contain files at any location. It's an old thing that nobody does, but a zip file can actually contain a path to an absolute file. So normally when you unzip something, it unzips into the directory that you unzipped it, but they don't have to. Zip files can actually unzip into other directories when you unzip them. So you can zip a file pointing at your C drive, and then when you unzip it, regardless of where the zip file was when you unzipped it, it will unzip that file to your C drive. That's a zip slip. So what can happen is games can be vulnerable to that too, where if they have their proprietary, you know, pack format, or if they're using zip files, or I forget what Unreal uses for its format. If you have an archive format and it's vulnerable to that kind of attack, then when the game tries to load the mod, even before it's activated the mod, just unzipping it can sometimes put files on other places of your operating system. So you can, for instance, overwrite System32 and wreck your Windows installation. You can put a plugin into your Chrome browser directory, or your plugin directory in Chrome, and suddenly install a scraper plugin into Chrome. There's all kinds of weird junk that can happen, even just from the game engine trying to open a modded file. Security's a really fun, if you ever want a career that makes you paranoid, that's a great one for it. But you know, that's why, you know, Rivermod, for example, that's why it's open source. That's why I have all the code up here, because I'm paranoid about it, and I don't want other people to, you know, they shouldn't trust me. They shouldn't have to trust me. They should be able to look at the code and build it for themselves and say, I don't want to download the pre-built thing. I don't trust this random guy on the internet. I'm going to go check the code myself and make sure it's not doing something nasty when I install it. Yeah, that's the unfortunate thing about modding. And I think that's why a lot of games will just put up the generic disclaimer about anything you do from this point on, if you activate modding, is your fault. If you wreck your computer, we do not take ownership. It's also why you'll see very few games will officially endorse mods, because from a legal liability perspective, you know, even let's say that somebody makes a mod for your game for VR support, you know, whatever kind of game you're making, somebody makes a VR mod and you like it. Maybe it works great. Maybe they even publish the code for it and the code looks good. You've looked at it. It looks fine. It's not doing anything malicious. And you're like, hey, I want to officially endorse this VR mod. What happens if that modder, their GitHub account or whatever, gets compromised? You know, they were using a weak password or something. Somebody comes in, logs into their account, and they change the code to be malicious. You officially endorse that mod, and now a mod you're officially endorsing might be stealing people's information. That's not like a crazy thing either. That actually happens all the time, not just with games. In fact, it probably happens a little less with games, but it happens all the time. It's called a software supply chain attack, where, you know, some third party that you rely on or you endorsed wasn't doing their security well enough. They got compromised, and something that was initially legitimately safe is now not safe. So it can be a whole thing. So you got to be, it's one of those things where you almost should probably be I say almost, you probably should consult a lawyer about it. You know, maybe not a ton of their time, you know, but to just say, hey, look, I want to cover myself legally here, in case somebody does something malicious. I want to know what I need to do personally to make sure that I'm not going to be liable because an attack, you know, a malicious person put a Bitcoin miner in the mod, and you know. So yeah, that's the fun legal side that can come into game development too. That's also why there's a really good talk. I think it's actually 2 or 3 talks on. I think they're available on YouTube still, but Game Developer Conference, GDC. There's a guy who did a series of talks on game law. I think they're called like, I forget what they're called. There might be game copyright 101, 102 or something. They're named like college courses, like 101, 102, 201. Those are good to look at because the guy goes into detail about why you should have an LLC before you like release your game. because the LLC will protect you from a lot of trouble. The other thing I can tell you I've looked at, because I've looked into getting an LLC set up myself before I do a commercial game. A lot of sound libraries. There is a really famous library called the General that contains like thousands of sounds, and it's used by like tons of Hollywood movies, tons of video games. It's been around for like, I think, over a decade. But you have to be careful with it, because one of the things about it, and I could be misquoting here, but I believe it was this library, had a note in the licensing for it that you cannot allow people to extract the audio from your finished product. But basically every game ever, you have to have the audio file somewhere on the computer. So it's one of these weird things where like you can't stop somebody from extracting audio from a game. There is no way. It has to play on their computer. No amount of encryption you do will ever stop somebody from extracting it. So if you buy that library and somebody extracts the sound effects because they think they're cool, you could potentially be in trouble with the license on your audio library and be on the hook for a lot of money if they choose to do something about that. Whereas if you have an LLC and you buy that library under an LLC, and, you know, hopefully it never happens, you never have to worry about it. I presume with that library in particular, they rarely enforce it. But if they did, they can't come after you personally. They have to go after the LLC at that point. So if the worst case scenario happens, it's not you personally financially on the line, it's your company on the line. That's why it's called an LLC, Limited Liability Corporation. I have a friend who does some film stuff, and the same thing was recommended to them about movies, is don't ever start, you know, don't hire artists, don't start doing anything until you have an LLC to put all the contracts under, to make sure that if anything goes wrong and there needs to be a dispute, it's happening with the LLC, not with you personally, and it's not your personal money on the line. Yeah, and, you know, it's like the disclaimer. It's better to do it, and even though it's a hassle to do, than to wish you had done it after the fact. But it's getting late here. I think I'm gonna call it there. You know, good talking about modding. Like I said, I do need to do some work on Rivermod. Right now Rivermod is like 3 separate executables, and I want to refactor them to be one so that I can start making improvements to it. So if that's something you're interested in, I might be doing a stream about that. I don't know if it'll be this week, but sometime soon in the next couple weeks, I was thinking. Other than that, I'm also going to continue work on this example game. Probably do some work on that off camera, though. I don't think I'm going to do it all on camera. But for me, I think I'm going to call it. I wish you the best of luck with your reading on the C# book. I'll definitely keep an eye on that myself. I'm curious about that book. And any other VOD watchers, anyone else, if you're working on a game, I wish you the best of luck. If you're doing modding, I wish you the best of luck with that too. And yeah, take it easy.